What if Earth once knew a second moon and simply forgot? What if another light once drifted across the ancient sky, soft as a lantern carried by time itself, guiding tides that no longer exist, whispering stories the planet has since buried, under continents, oceans, and silence? Wherever you are tonight, in whatever quiet corner the hours have led you, I'm glad you're here. The night is wide, the world is tired, and even the stones are dreaming. So let the mind loosen, let the breath soften, let the story arrive like a tide that remembers just enough to return and forgets just enough to rest. Because some myths are not born from imagination. Some myths are simply memories. The earth has not spoken aloud in a very, very long time. It begins in a darkness older than memory, a darkness so complete that even silence had not yet learned its shape. The earth was young then, not in years, but in the softness of things not yet formed. The crust still wandered, the seas still whispered without waves. Time itself had not learned to walk. It drifted, unanchored, like smoke rising from a forgotten fire. In that early hush, before continents divided and mountains decided where to stand, the sky carried two small lights, not bright, not bold, just quiet companions, wandering through a world, still discovering what a night could be. One light was familiar, the great moon, the one that endures, the one that still lifts tides and steadies the planet's breath. But beside it, moving with a softer glow, was another, a smaller lantern, a gentler pull, a moon that never learned to leave a name behind. It drifted close to its sibling, as though afraid to be swallowed by the dark. Some nights, the two glowed like twin embers, hovering over a world that had not yet decided to dream. Other nights, the smaller light dipped low, casting a second, faint shadow on the newborn seas. Earth felt both pulls, one strong, one barely a murmur, and the oceans responded with a rhythm unlike the one known today. The tides rose in layers, not heights. They drifted outward, like breath leaving warm lungs, and sank inward, like old stories returning to the place they began. Nothing rushed, nothing hurried. The world was patient then, and patience, like gravity, is a sculptor. These two lights carved the first lullabies into Earth's surface. Soft ripples became basins. Basins became seas. Seas became ancient cradles, where future lives would one day wait. But none of that mattered yet. Life was just a thought. The planet had not spoken aloud. What mattered was the sky, the double glow, the double shadow, the strange and gentle pull of two moons guiding a world that did not yet know how many memories it would carry. Some nights, the smaller moon passed, so close to the larger one that their light blended, creating a pale ring of silver, stretched thin across the air. It was not bright enough to break the darkness. It did not reveal the land or chase away the void. It simply existed as a soft reminder that even in its earliest hours, Earth was not alone. The larger moon moved with certainty, its path steady, its glow unwavering. But the smaller one wavered. It trembled in its orbit, its path like a thought, half remembered and easily lost. Sometimes it drifted farther out, as though reaching for something it could not name. Other times it pulled inward, seeking comfort in the gravity of its brighter sibling. If the stars noticed, they did not speak. Stars are ancient things. They have seen too many worlds, carry too many moons, to call any configuration remarkable. To them, Earth's two shadows were simply another quiet arrangement in a sky filled with forgotten symmetries. But to Earth, the presence of two moons was a conversation, a shaping, a slow gravitational whisper, telling the planet how to breathe. The tides shifted because of them. The crust cooled beneath their gaze. The very tilt of the planet carried their influence, subtle as dust, persistent as dawn. Every wave that rose carried a little of the smaller moon's rhythm. Every wave that fell carried a little of its fading breath. Earth does not remember these details. as facts. It remembers them. The way stone remembers pressure, the way fossils remember touch, the way deep water remembers what it has swallowed. For memory, in worlds, is not kept in words. It is kept in shape. And so the planet held the story. In the slow cooling of its mantle, the gentle wobble of its axis, the soft pull of tides that rose not once, but twice, a layered rhythm, a double heartbeat, two shadows, two lights, two forgotten sculptors tracing their quiet patterns into the face of a world that had not yet opened its eyes. There were no witnesses, no creatures to look upward and notice the strange dual glow, no ancient beings to wonder why the night carried two pale breaths instead of one. The oceans watched, but oceans do not speak. The mountains listened, but mountains had not yet grown tall. Only the darkness observed, holding the scene. With the gentleness of a cradle, time thickened. Millions of years drifted past, like grains of ash, falling slowly through still air. The smaller moon continued its wandering, quiet, constant, shaping the earth, with a presence so faint it might as well have been a memory, made of stone dust. Yet even faint things leave marks. Even forgotten companions leave artifacts in the way tides breathe, the way continents shift, the way night settles itself over sleeping seas. In this early world, Earth learned tenderness from its smallest moon, a tenderness of gravity, a tenderness of balance, a tenderness expressed in the gentle rise and fall of waters that had not yet learned to host reflections. But nothing stays unchanged, not even patience, not even the softest orbit, not even a moon that never asked to be remembered. For even then, in the deep beginning, in the long hush before life, a drift had begun, a slow descent, a quiet unravelling of the delicate gravitational thread that held the smaller moon in its gentle path. The Earth did not protest. Gravity does not argue. It simply waits for everything to return. And slowly, softly, the second moon began its long fall into forgetting. But that part of the story belongs to later chapters. For now, the world still holds two shadows, two lights, two quiet companions moving across a sky that had not yet learned the meaning of loss, and the tides rise in layers, breathing in rhythms that no longer exist. Because once, in a time the planet itself barely remembers, the night held two moons, and the earth listened to both. The small moon's presence smelled of salt and old rain, though no rain had yet learned its own name. Its gravity was a secret language, spoken softly into the planet's skin, and the earth answered in slow gestures, the lengthening of low tides, the patient folding of shallow basins, the mild leaning of a crust that had not yet hardened into stubbornness. Where the larger moon demanded ceremony, the smaller one suggested a whisper. It taught the seas how to hesitate, how to hold back the urge to break, how to gather themselves in layers like remembering. Those layers slept beneath the surface, compacting into memories that were not yet fossils, but felt like promise, thin, pliant, waiting. Night after night, the two moons rehearsed their slow duet. The larger moon kept its steady arc, as if reciting an old poem. The smaller one improvised, answering in gentle crescendos that rose and fell like thought. Sometimes, when the smaller moon edged near the horizon, its light brushed the nascent coasts and made them glimmer as though remembering a song. Small currents learned to follow that light, tracing patterns that would, beneath the years, become the fingerprints of continental shelves. The planet took these gestures into itself, carrying them inward to where rock grows quiet and patient. There, in the hidden chambers of the earth, the echoes of the double night nested, altering the slow chemistry of cooling stone. No thunder announced the small moon's touch. No bright flash marked its influence. It moved like an unpolished memory, leaving impressions felt rather than described. The seas spoke of it in the language of swells and hushes. Sediment recorded it in the faint tilt of layered deposits. Even the wind, which had not yet learned to roar, took on a rhythm shaped at the edges by the moon's pull. It was an orchestration without conductors, a choreography of tiny forces that together, nudged a world toward a form it had not chosen but that it accepted as necessary. This twin presence taught the planet to fold. Layers of water, of air, of early sediments learned to stack themselves with restraint. Where a single moon might have coaxed bold, singular tides, the pair produced complexity, subtle interference patterns that crafted small, protected shallows. There, warmth would linger where otherwise it might have slipped away. Those shallow pockets became slow cradles, places where temperature and time conspired to gather the first hesitant chemistry of life. Not life yet, only the taut possibility of life, but the planet, in its patient way, began to understand how to shelter possibility. The small moon's whisper pressed into these places like a finger pressing into wax, leaving soft, meaningful imprints. Silence coated everything like dust. Silence is not absence, it is texture. It molds itself around forms and makes contours legible. In the hush of that world, the twin moons were the only punctuation. They punctuated nights with two tones, two pressures, two kinds of demand. One asked for constancy, the other asked for attention. One set a steady clock, the other suggested an alternate counting, a second hand that measured softer intervals. Over time, the difference between those counts became a landscape. Valleys tilted toward one rhythm, plateaus favored another. The planet, which does not speak in words, recorded these distinctions as shape. There were nights when the smaller moon sulked behind the larger, hiding in its shadow. Those hours were less bright, but rich with nuance. Shadows layered upon shadows, and the sea learned to know depth without seeing it. Light became not merely a way to reveal, but a way to acquaint, to make certain forms recognizable by gentle pointing rather than by harshness. The smaller moon's retreats taught patience again how to accept disappearance as an ordinary happening, how to let absence be another form of presence. The planet listened and folded that lesson into the grain of its rock. Such tenderness, however, carries within it a fragile logic. The smaller orbit that allowed for intimacy with the large moon also contained the seeds of change. Orbits are only slow stories. They tell nothing loudly, but everything eventually. Each revolution nudged the smaller moon's path in ingeling ways, tiny adjustments that were not noticed in the thrum of eons. Gravity, impartial and unromantic, straightens curves and sharpens inclinations. Small differences compound. What began as a gentle wobble in the smaller moon's path grew, imperceptibly, into a longer arc. The duet persisted, but its harmony began to warm into dissonance. The planet felt this too, though not as anxiety. Earth registered change as a retuning. The layers of water shifted in subtle phase. Currents that had once braided together found themselves slightly misaligned, basin edges altered by millimeters. When memory is sediment, a millimeter matters. It is the difference between a note sustained and a note dropped. The chemistry in hidden pockets of shallows adjusted. Some places became less hospitable to the slow experiments of pre-life, while others, ironically, became more so. The small moon's faint hand moved across the scales of possibility, and those scales reordered themselves with a gentle click. There was an economy to this loss and gain. Some environments softened under the moon's waning influence, their delicate arrangements dispersing like breath. Others, conversely, consolidated into new stabilities, formed by the small moon's last, decisive manipulations. The planet learned that forgetting is not purely subtraction. It is also the rearrangement of what remains. Nothing truly vanishes without leaving a trajectory. A path is left for subsequent things to follow. The double night's final influence would be less a violent erasure than a folding layers pressed together until differences blurred into new, usable grain. In those folded places, the Earth kept its quiet catalogues. Pressure lines, micro-tilts, subtle lap patterns in sediment, these were the planet's marginal notes. Future geologists, not yet in existence, might call these anomalies and puzzle over them with instruments and equations. But the true record was tactile, embodied. It required no interpretation so much as a slow learning to feel its contours. The small moon's legacy would not translate cleanly into words. It would become, instead, a set of whispers etched into the way continents would one day crack and into the manner that coasts would retreat. For now, however, the night remained double, patient as a closed hand holding a tiny lantern. The smaller moon's glow, though soft, insisted on being a factor. It taught the Earth that multiplicity of influence could be gentle and sustaining. It taught the seas to hesitate. It taught the quiet mathematics of tidal overlap, the endless, soft arithmetic that shapes shorelines. There was an intimacy to all of it, a closeness that felt like a secret told slowly across a fire made of stone and water. But the universe is unhurried in its departures. The small moon's unwinding would not be sharp. It would be a temperate decay, a slow loosening of an orbital thread that had once held companionable rhythm. The planet would adapt, absorb, and retain never perfect, never whole, but carrying forward enough to bear witness in its surfaces. In this way, loss would not be catastrophe, but transformation, and the story of two shadows would continue to speak through the quiet architecture of things yet to form. The double night persisted for longer than the heart could imagine, long enough for the Earth to learn not only to hold a companion, but to be shaped by its fading. Light taught shape. Shape taught memory. Memory, in turn, began to ask new, quieter questions about balance, about the economy of intimacy, about the modest demands of companions that are not meant to stay. And beneath the hush of those questions, the small moon moved, patient as fog. It drifted along a path that would one day open into forgetting, and the planet accepted that it would keep, somewhere, the outline of a second pale hand. The night, doubled and soft, continued its slow, ancient breathing. The nights lengthened in ways no creature would ever witness, stretching themselves like slow fabric pulled across the curvature of the world. In that extended darkness, the two moons performed their patient ritual, tracing arcs that glowed faintly above the still-forming oceans. The larger moon remained deliberate, composed, its path broad and unwavering. The smaller moon, however, drifted with a softness that felt almost hesitant, as if aware that every movement it made would leave a delicate impression on a world learning to steady its breath. There was a tenderness to the smaller moon's presence, but also a restlessness. Even when the skies were clear, its glow appeared filtered, as though passing through a veil of ancient dust. It did not shine to illuminate, it shone to accompany. A secondary glow, quieter than memory, kinder than revelation. It softened the dark without interrupting it, stitching faint silver seams into the fabric of night. The earth felt those seams in its tides, in the quiet tug on its mantle, in the way sediments arranged themselves along newborn continental rims. As the smaller moon's orbit stretched and shifted, the oceans responded with two overlapping pulses. Each pulse was a story told in water, one strong and deliberate, guided by the primary moon, the other subtle, a faint echo still learning how to speak. Where the pulses met, they created calm pools, basins where water lingered longer than intended. These still places collected heat and minerals, letting them settle into thin, shimmering layers. In those layers, the chemistry of possibility thickened quietly, slowly, like silt gathering in the fold of a forgotten riverbed. The planet held these layers close, though nothing alive yet existed to claim them. Life was still an unwritten thought, floating just beneath the surface of what might one day become memory. Yet even in this early epoch, Earth behaved as though preparing for an arrival. It built warm pockets, it crafted soft shallows, it tucked away ingredients in the crevices of tidal pools carved by the twin gravitational breath of two moons. Every arrangement was a gesture of readiness, though readiness itself had no name. One night, the smaller moon drifted unusually near the horizon. Its glow stretched thin, almost trembling. The larger moon hovered higher, calm, confident in its broad sweep of the sky. Together, they cast twin shadows across the young seas, shadows that overlapped like layered ink. The waters responded, leaning gently toward one light, then the other, undecided. In that indecision, new currents formed, swirling patterns that would one day shape the architecture of coastlines. These were not dramatic shifts. They were quiet corrections, small adjustments in the planet's long exhale. The shadows moved slowly, sliding across the water's surface, with a patience that belonged only to celestial bodies. Even after the smaller moon slipped behind the larger, its influence lingered like warmth after a touch. The earth carried that warmth inward, folding it into basalt chambers cooling beneath the crust. Stone is a keeper of secrets, And even then, the planet was beginning to gather a secret it did not yet know how to articulate, that loss was on its way, and that memory would one day be all that remained. The double night brought with it a kind of emotional gravity, though emotion did not exist in any being capable of feeling it. The gravity was metaphorical, a tension held in the planet itself, a sense that this configuration was temporary. The smaller moon's orbit was not stable. It wobbled ever so slightly, a subtle defiance against the elegant circle traced by its larger sibling. With each wobble, it drifted closer, its path tightening by imperceptible degrees. If the larger moon noticed, it did not react. Companions do not always sense the unraveling of each other's trajectories. Meanwhile, the seas absorbed the shift. Waves that once rose in layered synchrony began to fall slightly out of phase. The crests arrived sooner than expected. The troughs lingered longer than they should. The ocean floor rearranged itself in response. Ridges tilted. Valleys deepened. Shallows migrated. The earth accepted these changes without resistance, the way a sleeping figure adjusts unconsciously to a shifting dream. Above, the smaller moon continued its approach. Not a fall, just a drift, a slow yielding to the planet's gravity, a silent surrender. The light it cast sharpened, not in brightness but in tone, like the last note of a quiet song held just a bit too long. Its glow painted faint, trembling reflections onto the tides, as though it were imprinting its story into water before the chance slipped away. Time stretched. Eons passed like slow breaths. The smaller moon's orbit drew gradually inward, carving an ever tighter spiral that would ultimately lead to forgetting. But forgetting is never abrupt. It begins with subtle changes, with the soft erasure of edges. The smaller moon's path, once graceful in its irregularity, began to flatten. Its motions grew predictable. Even the tidal overlap, once complex and layered, simplified. The seas lost a variation they did not understand they possessed. Earth noticed not with awareness, but with shifting patterns. The planet's tilt trembled by a fraction. Volcanoes, still infant in their ferocity, changed the tone of their eruptions. Deep rock cooled unevenly. The chemistry of warm tidal shallows shifted again, testing the boundaries of what might someday become the earliest self-sustaining reactions. Possibility reconfigured itself. The larger moon remained steady, lending a kind of calm gravity that the world relied upon without knowing it. Its sibling, however, grew more fragile in its path. Its influence still present, but stretched thin. Its tug on the planet weakened in long arcs, only to intensify briefly when it drifted close. These pulses shaped the Earth in asymmetrical ways, subtle distortions that would one day confuse scientists searching for perfect explanations. But nature does not craft perfection. It crafts traces. The double shadow nights became softer. The smaller moon's glow blurred. It appeared diffused, scattered by dust that accumulated in its wake. Even the stars behind it shimmered strangely, refracted through the thin halo of debris the moon carried like a faint, dissolving crown. It was changing, though not visibly enough for the sky to announce the transformation. And yet, the Earth knew. Not consciously, but in the quiet adjustment of tides, in the slow reshaping of coastlines, in the layers of sediment settling differently each generation of waves. The world was preparing, in its patient way, for the inevitable unspooling of a celestial companionship. Still, for now, the small moon remained. It drifted through the sky with the gentle insistence of a thought that refuses to be forgotten. It cast its pale light across the waters, across the cooling stones, across the long shadows of a world still deciding what it might become. And the Earth, ever patient, continued to listen. For even in the shifting of orbits, even in the first quiet steps toward disappearance, the night carried two lights, two shadows, two stories unfolding at once, one steady, one fading, woven together into the earliest fabric of time. Nothing rushed, nothing broke. The world simply breathed, and the moons drifted on. The smaller moon carried its silence like a coat folded against the chest. Not absence, but a presence defined by restraint. It did not announce itself with bright authority or boast. Instead, It moved through the sky, with the discretion of something that knows its own limits and honors them. Its glow was thin as paper and twice as intimate, as if the night had been pressed between soft palms and offered close to the ear. That intimacy taught the planet a different grammar, the grammar of small influences, of tiny steady pulls that adjust the whole without demanding gram notice. This companion spent its nights tracing private conversations with the Earth. Its gravity spoke in gentle increments, in the spacing between waves, in the half-formed shelves where water pooled longer than elsewhere. Those pockets were not loud. They were patient. They learned to hold warmth like a whispered secret. Within them, salts and minerals gathered with slow affection, arranging themselves in patterns that would one day read like footprints to those who could decipher such quiet scripts. The small moon's hand guided that arrangement, not by force, but by suggestion and insistence soft enough to be mistaken for coincidence, persistent enough to become habit. Silence keeps shape. The small moon taught the seas to shape themselves around stillness. Where the larger moon imposed a steady, broad cadence, the smaller one introduced nuance. Tides began to fold upon themselves, creating a layering that the planet accepted as texture. Shallow margins thickened. Channels found new meanderings. The coastlines, not yet confident in their permanence, I've learned to curve in ways that held back the ocean's appetite. Such curvature did not come from drama, but from the accumulation of small choices. Each night's faint tug was a choice, and choices, compounded, become architecture. The companion's silence was also a lesson in restraint. In nights when meteor dust freckled the sky, the smaller moon's light seemed to diffuse into a thin veil, as if modesty itself had become a physical filter. That veil blurred edges and softened contrasts. Light no longer cut, it suggested. Shadows were not cleanly carved but layered, overlapping like pages in a book left half open. In that layered dark, the planet learned to perceive gradations rather than absolutes. The surface kept these lessons in the slow curing of rock places, where bedding planes arrested, where lullaby-like rhythms of deposits sat like careful stitches across strata. There was economy to such silence. The companion took nothing loudly. It redistributed influence in subtle margins. Where one moon demanded the whole, the other apportioned attention in quiet quotas. The result was complexity without spectacle. Currents developed countervoices. Eddy patterns grew shyly ornate. Deposits that might have washed away under a single loud tide instead lingered and accreted, forming delicate shelves and pockets that would later cradle the earliest experiments of chemistry. Memory, as the world kept it, is not a ledger of headlines but a mural painted stroke by patient stroke. Sometimes, nights of twin light produced phenomena so soft that they could have been considered illusion. Mirrorings in shallow pools that repeated the same pale face twice, faint interference ripples that braided into slow moire patterns, the sea exhaling in phases that overlapped and lengthened. These were not events to be chronicled in bold scripts. They were small miracles of pattern, gifts that the silent companion left on the margins. Mountains had not yet grown tall to cast deep shadows, and so the moon's influence reached unbroken across wide, tentative plains of water. The planet kept these marks like marginalia, believing, without understanding, that they might someday matter. The small moon also taught the Earth the art of being secondary without becoming insignificant. Companionship need not equal equality of force. There is dignity in accompaniment. The planet learned to carry a second rhythm within itself, an inner meter that pulsed alongside the dominant one. That inner meter shaped the formation of shallow coves, the gentle bulging of continental edges, the tilt of sedimentary layers that would later puzzle curious scientists. Shape, like memory, is a patient teacher. What is pressed now into strata will speak in softer voices for ages. And yet, the companion's silence harbored vulnerability. Quiet influence can be erased by quieter stillness, and subtlety can be unmade by the slow patience of larger mechanics. Orbits are long poems written in the language of momentum. Even the gentlest stanza can unwind. The small moon's path, though graceful and restrained, contained inevitable instabilities. Each pass nudged it into slightly altered geometry, an almost sleeping rearrangement of vectors. Through countless revolutions, those small shifts compounded. The perfection of its economy, its ability to make much from little, was the same slenderness that would one day unthread its presence. The planet did not experience this as alarm. Earth registered change as recalibration. Where the small moon's tug decreased by the narrowest fraction, coasts compensated. Channels reoriented. Pools of warmth migrated a hair's breadth. The chemistry that had been arranging itself in delicate pools adjusted its tempo. Some places maintained their hospitable patience, others cooled and closed. The record of these adjustments would not bear dramatic signatures. They would be quiet anomalies, minute differences in layer thickness, faint tilts in bedding planes. For epochs to come, these would be the soft riddles preserved in stone. There were nights of odd tenderness, as the companion drifted closer in certain cycles, offering a temporary intensification of pull that braided the tides into particularly intricate patterns. Those were the nights the planet kept in its interior as favoured memories, the geological equivalents of lullabies. Basins deepened where they pleased. Warm pockets held longer. The materials that would later support complex chemistry lingered in ways they otherwise might not have. Possibility, though still only a faint rumour, pressed itself into being more insistently in these places. Silence, when held deliberately, can become language. The small moon's restraint taught Earth to be conversant in quiet, to encode influence in micrometers of tilt, in a few additional grains of silt, in the barely noticeable pause between crest and trough. What would one day be read as anomaly was, in truth, a deliberate lexicon of gentle force. The planet became fluent, not in storytelling, but in a mode of shaping that required patience to decode. Its memory became tactile, rather than declarative. And though the companion's orbit had its inevitable unravelling, its tenure was long enough to leave durable traces. The Earth's skin bore these traces in subtle layers, in curves that favoured softness over sharpness, in coastal shelves that held onto warmth. These are not grand relics to be placed upon pedestals. They are quiet legacies worked into the planet's habitual ways of folding and folding again. They are the planet's lessons in companionship and the modest mathematics of being altered gently. For a very long while, the small moon remained exactly what its name implied. A quiet companion whose influence was a slow, patient shaping rather than a proclamation. Its light taught the night an alternate tempo. Its gravity taught the seas how to wait. Its presence became part of the planet's vocabulary for holding possibility. In that vocabulary, silence was not emptiness but a form of abundance, the abundance that comes from insistence without noise. And as it moved, faithful to its soft orbit, the companion left the Earth with a set of interior notes, small, almost imperceptible adjustments that would one day ripple into forms not yet imagined. The planet kept them carefully, like pressed pages in a book that had not yet been opened. The silent companion continued its slow watch, its gentle hand shaping the margins of a world that, whether it knew or not, was learning how to remember. The moon's silence was not emptiness but a kind of delicate architecture. It hid its force in the margins and left instructions in margins only the patient could read. Where great moons carve landscapes with theatrical gestures, the quiet one taught subtler crafts, the art of holding water just long enough for a mineral to settle, the gentle insistence that a shallow must keep its heat through a long, indifferent night. Those acts were not heroic. They were domestic, intimate small arrangements that, over time, became the scaffolding for deeper transformations. The world learned to keep them as habits. Sediment learned to listen. Layers that once washed clear now hesitated at the lip of a shore, depositing in thin, careful films. Those films accumulated like the slow writing of a hand that writes no proclamation but keeps a list of small, faithful motions. In these thin pages of stone, the companion left a quiet grammar, patterns of ripple marks that repeated with faint irregularity, beds that showed a soft alternating of coarse and fine, the kind of alternation that speaks of two influences gently overlapping. The record was not loud. It was a set of nuanced repetitions, an archival practice performed in silence. There were nights when the small moon's pull intensified in a particular phase, and the world answered with an almost tender compliance. The tides braided into long, slow fingers that probed the edges of nascent continents, reaching inward to touch places that would later seed complexity. Those braided fingers sheltered pockets where temperature and chemistry could conspire without interruption. Within these sheltered folds, molecules pressed and paused, and improbable things had the leisure to arrange. Possibility is patient work, and the silent companion supplied patience like a soft scaffold. This quiet intervention also shaped the rhythm of erosion. Without a single overwhelming tide to sweep everything clean, coastlines learned to keep their histories close. Small headlands survived where a single dominant moon might have worn them away. Tiny coves preserved layers of organic slurries and mineral films, building micro-archives of environmental nuance. The planet's memory, in this regime, became textured rather than abrupt pages of geological history, stitched in delicate filament instead of stamped with bold, indisputable marks. Yet, there was an inevitable arithmetic to such restraint. Small forces must contend with the largeness of time. Each measured pull accumulated into trajectories not meant to last. Orbits, even gentle ones, are subject to the slow grammar of mechanics. The companion's path, steady in personal rhythm, was not immune to the cold bookkeeping of motion. Over epochs, its circle altered, drawing slightly inward in a patient surrender. The drift was not violent. It was the sort of forgetting that arrives like a sigh, soft, inevitable, containing within it 1,000-minute adjustments that eventualize into absence. The earth received those adjustments as new contours in habit. The littoral shelves rebalanced. Channels found new outlets. Thermal pockets reallocated warmth. In some places, the chemistry that had lingered finally ran its course and faded. In others, a last intensification of pull fortified an arrangement, giving it an extended lease on existence. Thus, forgetting became a selective craftsman, erasing in some rooms, reinforcing in others. The companion's waning did not mean simple loss. It meant the gentle reweaving of possibility into different patterns. Even as its orbit shortened, the small moon left behind a signature of relational intelligence, a way the planet would, in future ages, respond differently to subtle shifts. That intelligence was not conscious. It was a predisposition embedded in form, bays that tilt toward gentler oscillations, shelves that hold on to temperature like a memory, sedimentary laminations that record faint, alternating rhythms. These forms became the Earth's quiet bias towards certain climatic and chemical tendencies. The world's later histories would unfold along lines pre-shaped by these childlike lunar nudges. Night after night, the twin regimen continued. The large moon kept its slow clock. The small one measured softer intervals within each hour. The two together created interference patterns that were less about drama and more about tessellation, overlapping domains of influence that produced microclimates of stability. Where shadows doubled, the sea learned discretion. Where light braided, thermal gradients softened. Where pulls overlapped, eddies nested within eddies. In such nesting, complexity seeded itself without spectacle, like organisms arranging in a quiet microgarden. This subtlety produced a domestic kind of continuity. The planet developed an economy of small refuges, places held by the overlay of two tender tides, where change came slowly enough for novel arrangements to take hold. These were the actual cradles, humble and unadvertised, where slow chemical conversations could proceed without being hurried into collapse by single, sweeping forces. The quiet companion had, in its restraint, built an infrastructure for patience. That infrastructure would matter. It would be the unglamorous backdrop upon which later thresholds could be crossed. And there was a kind of ethics in the way the small moon influenced the world, an ethic of accompaniment. It did not dominate, did not demand. It accompanied. The planet learned that being shaped need not be synonymous with being overwhelmed. Structures can be suggested rather than imposed. Memory can be layered instead of replaced. Such ethics, coded into the rock and coastline, became a way the Earth would habitually negotiate change, with small adjustments, with margins preserved, with plenty of room left for later improvisations. Still, the companion's path was finite. Mechanics tightened around it like a patient hand. The once fluid orbit narrowed. Each pass came with a slight increase in tidal interference at certain latitudes, and certain shallow pockets that had long supported promising chemistries found their equilibrium altered. Some dissolved into less hospitable mix, cooling and spreading. Others consolidated and deepened. The silent companion's departure, when it finally completed its slow arc toward oblivion, would not be marked by catastrophe, but by a reallocation of niches, some lost, some transformed, some renewed in unexpected ways. Even in the face of this quiet vanishing, the small moon's legacy proved durable. It had taught the Earth a temperament of composure. It had impressed upon shorelines a reluctance to surrender all of their smallness at once. It had woven a scaffold of micro-refugia that could persist long after the light had dimmed. In layers of sediment and subtle tilts of strata, it left a vocabulary. Future investigators, reading with instruments they had not yet invented, might stumble on anomalies and call them puzzle. But the planet would keep its secret in the way coasts erode slightly less quickly, in zones once held by twin tides, in the stubborn presence of certain thermal pockets, in the particular folding of layered rock. So, the companion endured long enough to matter, and then mattered long after it faded. In its silence, it had taught endurance. In its privacy, it had taught a style of influence that was not loud but lasting. The planet, always impatient on the scale of human thought but patient on the scale of deep time, stored these lessons as habits that would, like a quietly taught language, allow future forms of life to speak in directions they might otherwise never have spoken. When at last the small moon slipped toward the edge of memory, the Earth did not mourn so much as rearrange. Loss was transformed into a new kind of architecture. The world folded the absence into itself, making room for other stories to be held. The companion's silence remained a voice inside the planet's long, rustling memory. The small moon's slow drift inward was almost imperceptible, so subtle that even the tides, which had long been its devoted audience, adjusted without knowing they were adjusting. That is the nature of gentle departures. They do not declare themselves. They unspool quietly, thread by thread, until the shape left behind is familiar enough to hide the absence. The Earth, wrapped in its deep-time patience, did not register the shift as loss, only as a rearrangement of its nightly breath. Yet the rearrangement deepened, and with it, the companion's influence stretched thin, a whisper lengthening into a sigh. Still, it glowed. Even in its waning, the small moon cast a diffuse silver that softened the edges of rock and water. The glow no longer reached as far as it once had, but it reached differently, more inward, more concentrated, as though saving its last strength to make gentle impressions where they mattered most. In this narrowing reach, its light touched the shallow basins that had been shaped under its long companionship. These basins held pockets of warmth like dim memories held close to the chest, and the companion moon warmed them further, encouraging one last chapter of delicate chemistry. It was as though the moon, sensing its diminishing presence, whispered to the waters, "Keep going, keep trying, keep becoming." The Earth accepted this final encouragement with its usual quiet composure. Warm pools thickened their mineral brew. Currents grew slower, more contemplative. Sediment settled in intricate filaments, each grain shifting just enough to catch a hint of the moon's last pattern. These filaments would later become microscopic freeze frames of influence records, not of catastrophe, but of subtle, cumulative shaping. To a future mind, they might seem like incidental wrinkles in the pages of stone, yet each wrinkle was the trace of a gravitational whisper, a small moon's final attempt at memory. Meanwhile, the skies began reflecting the moon's weakening rhythm. Nights grew slightly darker at the edges, as if dusk had learned to linger. The larger moon still ruled the sky with its steady glow, but the shadowed corners thickened. The stars behind the small moon no longer refracted through as wide a halo. The dust it once carried dispersed gradually, thinning like breath on a cold morning. The companion's visibility ebbed. It became faint enough that if witnesses had existed, they might have wondered whether it had ever been bright at all. In that faintness, the small moon's gravitational signature softened as well. The tides unfolded with less layering, more uniformity. The interference patterns that once produced delicate braids in shallow waters smoothed into single arcs. Coasts that had been shaped by the moon's dual rhythms began shifting towards simpler contours. Some coves that once lingered under twin pools began to open, their protective curvature relaxing. Other inlets closed slightly, as though turning inward to preserve a memory against the coming quiet. Loss, in the language of worlds, is not a moment but a migration. The small moon migrated deeper into the Earth's gravity well, each cycle pulling it into a slightly tighter embrace. This tightening did not come with violence. It came with inevitability. Gravity is patient. It asks only one question, over and over. How long can you resist? For the small moon, resistance was a finite art, and so the orbit narrowed, and the companion's nights shortened, and the sky began to shift its symmetry. Yet even as its orbit decayed, the small moon remained a sculptor of subtlety. Its final years, if years can be measured in epochs, were among its most influential. The closer it came to the Earth, the more precisely its gravity tuned the shallow places, stirring some pockets and calming others. Certain fragments of early chemistry found themselves held in suspension longer than before, pressing against the membrane of possibility like shadows testing the edge of form. Other fragments drifted apart, their brief arrangements dissolving into the sea. This was not selection, it was punctuation. The companion moon punctuated the ocean's long, slow sentences, giving rise to pauses where meaning could thicken. There were nights, rare but memorable to the world, when the small moon appeared nearly aligned with the large one. Their lights merged into a single, elongated shimmer reflected across the ocean's surface. These nights felt stretched, as though time had taken a breath and held it. During such moments, tides rose in harmonized pulses, one broader, one more delicate, creating a layered heave that traveled deep across the basins. Rock beneath the sea responded in microflexures. Faults strained invisibly. Mineral boundaries shifted translucently, setting the stage for distant transformations. But like all alignments, these moments passed, and each passing left the companions slightly dimmer. In its final stretches, the small moon's orbit contracted enough that its speed increased, and its nights seemed shorter. The Earth did not mind, it merely adjusted. Rocks do not protest. Oceans do not mourn. They respond. They incorporate. They remember by changing shape. And so the coastlines retuned themselves once again, flattening in places where the companion's hand once carved subtle arcs, deepening in places where its absence created new slack in the tide. The small moon, now nearly spent in influence, still drifted across the sky with the gentleness of a thought that refuses to disappear altogether. It completed its cycles faithfully, each orbit an echo of those long, soft millennia when it kept the Earth company in earnest. And though its gravity no longer braided tides as before, it still brushed the world, leaving faint signatures in the patterns of night winds. Those winds learned new rhythms lighter, less layered, and carried them across the open seas. The Earth, for its part, kept the silence. It accepted the companion's fading without resistance because it had already stored everything it needed. The lessons of dual influence were written into its structure. The subtle mathematics of two moons persisted in the curvature of coastlines, the temperaments of shallow seas, the long inheritance of sedimentary pages. Yet for now, the companion remained in the sky, diminished, yes, but present. A small, pale memory still drifting above the world it had shaped. Its glow was no longer strong enough to cast a clear shadow. But shadows are not the only measure of meaning. Light can leave its story even when it cannot draw a boundary, and the Earth, steady, patient, uncomplaining, continued to feel that faint touch, holding it quietly, the way a mind holds the echo of a lullaby long after the voice has faded. The ocean remembers in a different currency. It does not keep dates or names. It keeps gestures. It keeps the memory of tides as one keeps the memory of breath, an invisible archive made of rise and fall, of pressure and release. In the epoch when two moons walked the night, the sea learned a richer vocabulary. Where a single moon composes a regular, solitary cadence, two lights braided an elaborate dialect of pull overtones, delays, gentle interference that the water spoke without words. Those braided tides were not loud messages. They were textures pressed into the skin of seas, long, layered swells that overlapped like the pages of a slow, secret book. In the shallow edges, where land and ocean touch, and neither dares to claim the other entirely, The tides did the quiet work of composing. Layers of water arrived in measured folds, depositing films of mineral and warmth that hardened into the first modest archives. These layers were not uniform. They bore the fingerprint of two rhythms. One tide lifted the shore in a broad, faithful sweep. The other delayed, a softer return that allowed matter to linger. Where the pulses met, small lagoons formed like sewn pockets. In those pockets, heat hung longer than elsewhere, and chemistry moved with courteous slowness, giving improbable reactions the leisure to accumulate towards something like form. The sea's language is patience. It learns shape by rehearsal. Each doubled tide nudged sediments into particular arrangements, tiny asymmetries that would later confuse simplistic accounts of planetary history. These were not accidental quirks. They were the deliberate script of interference, a physics of overlap that made room for texture. Currents braided into nested eddies, flow patterns hid in the margins between more forceful motions. The ocean learned to keep secrets in its shallows, to fold possibilities into small, protected geometries, where the long experiments of pre-life might continue without being washed away by grander, single-pulse tides. Memory, in water, is stored as sequence. The doubled pull introduced sequences within sequences. Phase lags, micro-crescendos, momentary standstills where the surface held too long and cooled in strange gradations. These standstills became laboratories. Minerals that might otherwise disperse found time to cohere. Organic precursors, given time together in warm and stable pockets, could link into longer chains. The sea did not comprehend chemistry as intent. It simply created conditions where linkage became statistically more probable. What the tidal duet offered was duration, the soft chronology necessary for slow combinations to take root. Not every place benefited. The pattern of doubled tides produced both refuges and deserts. Some coasts, battered improperly by overlapping pulses, lost fine sediments that would otherwise have sheltered complexity. Others, quietly fortunate, collected the exact layering needed for gradual accretion. The geography of gift and loss was idiosyncratic, a patchwork tapestry woven by the specific interplay of lunar timing and coastal incline. In some bays, warmth pooled and lingered decade after decade. In others, the interference of tides scoured the seafloor clean, leaving high-energy plains inhospitable to delicate assemblies. The world learned that multiplicity of influence does not equal uniform benevolence. It creates heterogeneity, the true seedbed of long-term possibility. Because tides are slow storytellers, their effects accumulate in ways that outlast immediate perception. Rocks remember the rhythms that shape them. Bedding planes tilt in response to repeated asymmetries. Grain sizes stratify according to subtle differences in flow energy. Future readers of the planet's pages, if reading were ever to be undertaken, would find anomalies, alternate laminations, seams of fine minerals in unexpected places, misaligned paleo-shorelines. Those anomalies would be the ocean's marginalia, the small italicized notes where two moons once wrote in overlapping ink. There is a sadness in architecture that outlives its architect. The tidal patterns that constructed these gentle refuges were bound, by physics, to change. As the smaller moon waned, the elegant duet simplified. Interference patterns smoothed into the regularity of a single dominant tide. The sea adjusted like a creature waking into a narrower dream. Where once there had been braided complexity, there remained only the memory of rhythm pressed into stone. In some places, entire microhabitats sloughed away. In others, pockets found new equilibria. The sea learned to translate the grammar of two into the grammar of one, carrying remnants as folded phrases within a new tongue. Extinction in this language is not a single event, but the gradual muffling of cadence. Pools that had once been warm enough for long molecular conversations cooled. Layers that recorded delicate alternations ceased to be written. The story did not end. It thickened into a different narrative with fewer voices. What the ocean had gained under twin pulls became an inheritance fragmentary, enigmatic, lodged in the margins. Later, tides would read those margins passively, reshaping them further. Time's passage is an editorial process. Erasure, emphasis, reordering, and yet even in reduction there is residue that matters. The physical traces of braided tides, shelves that ran deeper, sediments that alternated in thin bands, provided preconditions for future patterns of life. Refugia that had once harbored improbable chemistry persisted as microclimates resistant to immediate change. They were not immune, but they were patient. When later conditions warmed or shifted in other directions, these pockets served as seedbeds, offering structural continuity in a world otherwise being remade. The sea's long memory thus acted as an archivist that preserved slivers of possibility across regime change. Tides also teach the planet humility. They show how large-scale regularity can be vulnerable to the quiet influence of a secondary hand. Even slight interference can produce outsized effects over time. What seems marginal in a single cycle can become determinative across eons. The ocean's braided past demonstrates that multiplicity of influence, modest, unassuming, patient, can yield a landscape richer and more varied than the one authored by a singular rule. The lessons imprint themselves in the coast's curvatures, in the manner that estuaries resist uniformity, in the long, folded strata that read more like music than like a ledger. In the end, the tides that no longer rise continue to speak. Their voice is softer now, embedded in stone and in the angles of drowned shelves. It is a voice for those who listen with instruments of patience, those slow attentions that measure grain by grain, layer by layer. The ocean, as keeper of the old duet, has become an archive of layered possibility, a quiet repository whose pages are damp and difficult to turn, but whose content, once read, alters the way subsequent tales unfold. Even after the second moon's light thinned and the dual cadence faded into the simpler rhythm known now, the sea carried its braided past like a memory under the skin, an internal geography that continued to steer, in small measures, the course of future formation. The tides no longer rise as they once did, but their earlier patterns remain folded into the world, soft instructions for what might re-emerge when conditions again align. The ocean remembers in the patient currency of shape. It remembers because shape keeps score in a language that outlasts notice. Where two moons once tugged, the sea still keeps its ledger. That ledger is not legible at a glance. It requires study and the patience of deep listening. It requires the evening and the dawn, and the slow folding of attention into the ways water tells its histories. The tide is a storyteller that does not speak. It shows. In the long epoch shaped by two moons, it showed the earth a way of moving that was neither singular nor predictable. Water rose not in one solitary gesture, but in layered breaths. First a broad exhalation guided by the larger moon, then a softer inhale coaxed by the smaller companion. These breaths interleaved like overlapping memories, each motion carrying its own quiet intention. Together they taught the ocean to hold complexity, to carry more than one rhythm at a time, to become a patient keeper of unfinished sentences. As epochs stretched onward, that layered breath carved itself deeper into the earth's edges. The coasts became archives of nuance. Small embayments developed where pulses met and hesitated, where water twirled in slow vortices before moving on. These places were not dramatic. Their shaping was almost timid, but timidity has its own artistry. Where the tides lingered, sediments layered with greater elegance, thin bands of alternating grain that told of the moonlit pauses between one pull and another. These films would later be locked into stone, becoming pages of a book the earth never intended to write but could not help composing. In the deeper reaches, far below the shimmer of any moonlight, the ocean's interior kept an even slower record. Pressure and distance muffled the immediate effects of the twin pulls, yet even here, the layered tides left whispers. The rhythmic alternation of surface waters filtered downward, influencing the drift of nutrients and heat. This created vertical tapestries of differing temperatures, layers of ancient water that moved sluggishly through the abyss. These layers acted as memory cells, the ocean's deep archive, preserving subtle cues about what the surface once was and what it might one day become again. This memory was not conscious, but structural. Time impressed itself into the water's density gradients, teaching the ocean to cradle warm pockets where chemistry could linger. In some of these places, early molecules practiced their slow arithmetic, combining, cleaving, linking again. The ocean did not choose these patterns, yet it shaped them quietly, with the absent-minded grace of something that has never needed to be deliberate. Every fold in the tide's rhythm became a fold in possibility, but as the smaller moon drifted inward, that second breath, the faint, patient inhale, began to falter. The ocean, accustomed to juggling two cues, felt a subtle thinning in its instructions. The first sign was not in the surface, but deep below, where temperature gradients began to smooth. Without the companion's lingering pull, the intervals between pulses shortened, and the water's internal structure became less intricate. Certain depths that once nurtured stable chemistries cooled just enough to discourage them. Other depths warmed slightly, destabilizing fragile molecular arrangements. The sea did not mourn these shifts. It simply obeyed the new arithmetic presented to it. Closer to the shores, the change was gentler but more visible. The layered tides that once smoothed the coastline into soft curves began to simplify. The sea pressed more evenly against the land, filling some inlets more fully while abandoning others to slow desiccation. Curved pockets that had nurtured subtle chemistries began to stretch thin. Some disappeared entirely, leaving only faint depressions filled with whispering sand. Others persisted, but their character changed. They became quieter refuges, isolated from the broader choreography of tides. These refuges, though altered, remained incubators of slow continuity, echoes of the old patterns living on in reduced form. There was a moment, if moments can be measured on such scales, when the two moons' rhythms crossed in a final harmony. The companion, in its diminishing orbit, passed at an angle that produced one last layered tide, soft, rich, more complex than any that would follow. That tide sculpted the coast with a final generosity, carving one more set of quiet lagoons, deepening one more fold of shoreline where warmth might hold. It was a gesture, unintentional yet unmistakable, a parting gift of complexity from a moon that would soon leave no signature strong enough to claim. After that, simplification set in. The tides learned a new discipline: singular, faithful motion, rise and fall in clean strokes, return without hesitation. The layered breath that once shaped the world flattened into a more predictable inhale-exhale pattern. Regularity replaced nuance, stability replaced suggestion. The ocean complied, reshaping its contours in smooth arcs rather than pleated folds. It became a world with one voice instead of two, but even in this new uniformity, remnants of the duet survived. Water does not forget what it has rehearsed. When the new tide pushed against the old shore, it encountered landscapes built by dual influences. It followed their paths not because it remembered, but because shape insists. Bays curved inward with graceful defiance. Submerged shelves dropped away in steps carved by overlapping pulses. The tide's new simplicity flowed across these forms, honouring the architecture even as it lacked the means to reproduce it. Memory persists in the stubbornness of shape. In quiet corners of the coast, the old tidal rhythm remained preserved like fossils of motion. Small pools still filled and emptied in complex intervals, responding to the geometry inherited from twin pools. Currents swirled in pockets that had been designed, unknowingly, by the companion's long partnership. These pockets held on to warmth, and warmth invited slow collaboration among molecules. Though the tide no longer braided itself as before, these inherited shapes continued their quiet service, maintaining zones where unlikely chemistry endured. The deeper ocean, too, carried remnants. Layers of ancient water, stratified by long-ago pulses, continued to drift, insulated from the surface's new simplicity. These layers moved along invisible rails, carved by the old gravity. Traces of the two-moon rhythm lingered in their density, their saltiness, their reluctance to blend too quickly. They were the deep ocean's ghosts, drifting archives of vanished choreography. Extinction, in this world, meant the loss of a rhythm, not the loss of meaning. The tides that no longer rose in layered breaths left behind the architecture of their influence. That architecture guided what came next, not by dictating, but by inviting. It offered small corners where stability persisted, even as the surface world adopted a new simplicity. Life, when it eventually arrived, would inherit these invitations. It would not know their origin, but it would follow their contours. This is how the ocean remembers, not in words, not in monuments, but in the subtle insistence of shapes that outlive the forces that formed them. The tides no longer rise as they once did, but the world still carries their signatures, folded into its coasts, braided into its depths, stitched into its long, drifting memory. The sea learned solitude slowly. It did not arrive as an abrupt silence, nor as a sudden simplification, but as a thinning and erosion of nuance, so gentle that the waters barely noticed they were losing a voice they had long depended on. The smaller moon's fading rhythm softened the ocean's complexity one layer at a time, like pages in a book becoming translucent with age. Where once the waters rose in intertwined pulses, they now climbed in a single, unbroken swell. The difference was not dramatic, it was tonal. The sea, which had always carried a duet inside its body, found itself singing alone. But water adjusts by remembering. Even when stripped of a partner, it continues to move through the geometries shaped in the old days. The coastlines, moulded by two influences, still coaxed the tide into faint hesitations. Bays that had been carved by layered rhythms kept their subtle indentations. Ridges beneath the surface still bore the scars of interference patterns, and the tide, though now singular, inherited these shapes like quiet instructions. It flowed along them without understanding, tracing curves designed by a relationship that no longer existed. In shallow waters, the transformation was most visible. Once, the layered breath of tides had left behind a mosaic of textures. Fine-grained pockets softened by delayed retreat, coarser ridges sculpted by overlapping surges. These mosaics remained long after the moon's influence waned, forming intricate micro-landscapes that guided how sediments continued to settle. The Earth's outer skin, its tidal margins, became a palimpsest, rewritten and overwritten but never truly cleared of previous scripts. Even as the new tide arrived with its single voice, it read those scripts in the only way water can, by flowing into them, filling their troughs, shaping itself around their memory. Some of these tidal remnants deepened over time. Without the smaller moon's gentle interference, certain pockets became too still. Their waters thickened with minerals, cooling more quickly in the dark and warming sluggishly in the dawn. These basins became heavy with sediment, transforming into early tidal flats. The flats did not breathe as the old seas once had. Their rhythms were quieter, more constrained. Yet within the stillness, they held onto a kind of lingering tenderness, the echoes of the old pattern pressed into their contours. Other regions, freed from the companion moon's complicating pull, stretched open. Their once folded shapes unfolded into broader curves. Shallows that had relied on dual tides to maintain their fine balances shifted into simpler systems. Some dried, others deepened. The planet's margins reconfigured, simplifying their grammar while keeping the faint accent of a lost language. If the ocean missed its second pulse, it did not show it. Instead, it moved forward with the strange combination of loss and continuity that characterizes all enduring things. Deep below, where darkness is not an absence but a weight, the old tides lived on a little longer. Layers of ancient water, set in motion by the two moons' twin influence, continued to drift on their inherited paths. These layers resisted change because depth protects memory. Temperature gradients retained the ghost of the old rhythm. Density structures kept their delicate stratifications. In some places, the deep ocean's interior even preserved pockets of warmth that had once been shaped by dual pulls. These pockets, now isolated from the surface world, moved slowly through the abyss like drifting archives. They were quiet envoys from a past no longer accessible, except through their continued presence. And the sea, like all storytellers, held these vestiges without pride or longing. It simply kept them, the way a stone keeps pressure lines long after the force that shaped them has vanished. Memory, for the ocean, is not the act of recalling, it is the act of embodying. Every current that passed through layered thermoclines touched the residue of the old rhythm and carried it forward, if only as a soft irregularity in the arc of its flow. Meanwhile, on the surface, the tides continued their slow shift into uniformity. The arrival of the single moon's dominance brought predictability. The sea responded by flattening its complexity into a steadier rhythm. It rose at expected times and withdrew in more even sweeps. The layered hesitation that once defined its movement became rare, appearing only in corners of the coastline where geometry enforced memory. These corners held onto complexity, like small sanctuaries, quiet, stubborn, relics of a world shaped by multiplicity. In one such sanctuary, shallow waters warmed in a pattern inherited from the old days. Layers of temperature settled into a fine staircase structure. It was here that molecules, newly coaxed into chains by the world's slow experiment in chemistry, found conditions gentle enough to linger. The old tides were gone, but their fingerprints allowed future possibilities to quietly continue. Even a faded memory can shelter becoming. Elsewhere, the legacy of the two moons persisted in the subtle bending of currents. Some currents curved when they should have straightened, following ghost paths laid down by interference patterns long vanished. Others slowed in regions where the companion moon had once deepened basins. These aberrations meant little to the sea now, but they laid groundwork for future migrations, future ecosystems, future climates. The world was being sculpted by influences that no longer existed, sculpted by the residue of what once was. This is how extinction behaves in the realm of tides, not as a severing but as a fading. The ocean does not forget the old pulse. It accommodates the new one, yet the shape of the old remains imprinted in the coastline, in the deep water's layered persistence, in the tilted sedimentary plains that tilt because they once had reason to. The earth does not unlearn what shaped it. It simply grows into new vocabularies, and in time, the ocean came to accept its quiet solitude. Its surface grew clearer, its rhythms steadier, its voices fewer. But beneath that simplicity, the memory of layered tides still moved, a soft undercurrent shaping the world from below. The ocean learned to become the keeper of lost pulses, the archive of vanished moons, carrying forward the faint residue of a duet that once taught it how to breathe. The tides no longer rose as they once did, but memory, in water, lingers far beyond the moment of forgetting. It lingers in the shape of every shore, in the depth of every basin, in the slow drift of currents that recall patterns no longer sung in the sky. It happened so slowly that even the sky forgot to record the moment. There was no cry, no shudder, no fracture streaking across the dark. The smaller moon simply began to rest, first in its orbit, then in its light, and finally in the quiet spaces between its own breaths. A surrender not chosen, but inherited from the long arithmetic of gravity. The earth felt the change the way a sleeping body senses a shift in the room, not through sight, not through sound, but through the subtle rearrangement of balance. The tides leaned slightly differently. The winds altered their tone. A faint stillness flowed across the shallow seas, as though the water were learning a new lullaby, but could not yet decide how to hum it. The small moon's orbit, once an elegant oval, tightened with each passing age. Not dramatically, not visibly. Each revolution brought it closer by a measure smaller than a breath, a motion too fine for the sky to name. And yet the path was certain. Gravity is patient, and patience always collects its due. The moon continued its gentle wandering, but the wandering grew tired. It no longer glided with the same youthful irregularity. Its approach and retreat lost their spirited asymmetry, and the faint wobble that once gave the tides their layered texture began to smooth into a weary rhythm, like an old lantern whose flame still burns, but flickers more often than it dances. Its light dimmed, not because it lacked brightness, but because its angle toward the earth shifted in subtle degrees. Its face turned slightly, offering less of itself to the sky. Shadows deepened across its surface, soft, blurred, like dust settling over long-forgotten carvings. It became a moon half present, half drifting into a dream only it could see. The earth watched without watching. Planets do not resist what time grants. They absorb, they yield, they restructure themselves around the gentle inevitabilities of celestial drift. In those nights, when the small moon dipped low on the horizon, its light trembled, not from weakness, but from the thickening layers of atmosphere through which it peered. The glow stretched into a thin, wavering line, as though the moon were yawning, taking one long breath before surrendering to rest. Below it, the oceans mirrored the tremor. Waves hesitated, their crests lingering a moment longer before they fell. The layered tides that once rose in duet began losing their delicate interplay. The larger moon continued its ancient sweep, lifting the water with steady insistence. But the smaller companion lagged, its pull arriving too late, too soft, sometimes not at all. This was not decay. It was the beginning of sleep, a celestial drowsiness settling into orbital bones. As the moon slowed, its orbit began to circularize, becoming more even, more predictable. But predictability was not its nature. It had been a wanderer, a quiet sculptor of asymmetry, a painter of faint differences. Now it surrendered those roles, letting the world drift into simpler rhythms. The nights changed color. Where once the horizon held two silhouettes, one bright, one hesitant, the second now blurred into the dark, a pale smudge barely separating itself from emptiness. The sky lost a layer of meaning, though meaning is not something the sky mourns. It simply grows quieter in its own vastness. As epochs pressed onward, the companion moon's path decayed further. The Earth's gravity pulled it inward, not harshly, not greedily, but with the gentle certainty of a parent guiding a child, toward a place of rest. The moon complied, its pace slowing, its arc softening. It drifted into closer cycles that no longer influenced the seas with any authority. Its presence became a whisper, a suggestion, a fading punctuation mark at the end of the world's long sentence. Still, the small moon kept orbiting, held not by purpose, but by the ancient momentum it had always known. Each pass brought it slightly lower, as though it were sinking into a deep, cosmic sleep. It did not resist. Resistance has no place in the mathematics of celestial bodies. Everything yields eventually. And so the tides continued their transition, from duet to solo, from layered breath to single inhale. The sea adjusted without complaint, its motions simplified, its memory contracting in scale, but not in depth. Even as the companion moon faded, the ocean held its influence within its own shape, in the angled shelves, the soft-bellied coves, the layered sediments that remembered, the moon's long companionship. Above the dark water, the moon glowed faintly, a soft ember against the vast cold. Its shadow grew shallow, barely thick enough to leave an impression on the land. Its once subtle tug had become a gentle brush, felt only by the most sensitive corners of the tide. It was falling asleep, and the earth, without knowing, was adjusting its heartbeat to match. For celestial bodies do not vanish abruptly. They drift into silence, into stillness, into the soft arithmetic of forgetting. The smaller moon entered this arithmetic, one quiet age at a time, laying itself down upon its decaying orbit, like a creature folding into rest. And as it dimmed, the sky adapted, and the world continued its patient spinning, ready to receive whatever stories the sleeping moon would leave behind. The smaller moon drifted inward with the gentleness of a feather settling through layers of still air. Nothing about its motion suggested urgency. Nothing hinted at collapse. It simply moved closer, in the way dusk moves toward night smoothly, seamlessly, with no boundary between what was and what would be. Its descent was a kind of surrender, but not a tragic one. More like a fading lantern that continues glowing for as long as its wick allows, even as the flame grows thin and quiet. Its orbit carved smaller circles now, each loop drawn tighter around the Earth's gravity. These circles, once beautifully uneven, began to lose their irregular charm. Gone were the days when the companion moon strayed slightly off course, creating those delicate, layered tides that shaped the shorelines with tender asymmetry. Gone were the faint hesitations in its path that once whispered uncertainty into the night sky. What remained was a narrowing, a quieting, a settling. As the moon drifted lower, the world beneath it changed its tone. The atmosphere thickened its response, bending the faint moonlight into elongated bands that shimmered like silvered fog. When the moon rose, it did so with a pale, weary glow. Its light stretched too thin to illuminate the land, yet too persistent to disappear. On windless nights, The moon seemed almost suspended, floating within its own halo, half luminous and half lost. The sea felt this change more intimately than land ever could. The tides had long been the companion's confidants, responding to its faintest pull with subtle choreography. Now, the water learned a new rhythm, the rhythm of a diminishing influence. Where once the tide swelled in soft duet, the sea now lifted its shoulders more reluctantly. A single moon guided the primary motion, but the smaller companion, drifting nearer, imposed a faint tremor, a shadow of a tide that no longer fully formed. Some nights, the two pulls aligned for a moment. In those rare hours, the sea rose ever so slightly higher, cresting with a memory rather than a force. But the moment always passed, leaving the water to settle again into its simpler cadence. The ocean, patient as ever, accepted this fading. Water does not cling to what changes. It adapts, absorbs, carries forward. As the companion moon decayed inward, friction between it and the Earth's gravity field exchanged small amounts of energy in whispers. The moon slowed just enough for the Earth's rotation to tug it closer. This quiet exchange shaped the planet's nights in delicate increments, increment after increment, age after age, until the moon's presence felt more like a lingering thought than a celestial partner. Its surface cooled unevenly, shadows deepening in craters that once caught brighter light. Dust lifted in tiny clouds when meteoroids brushed its skin, hanging briefly in the low gravity before settling again as thin blankets of powdered time. The moon's face aged with this slow burial, softened by layers of memories it could not keep. And yet it continued, orbit after orbit, growing dimmer, drifting inward in a slow curl. To an impossible observer, it would have resembled a creature folding itself into sleep, drawing close, tucking in, letting the world cradle it more tightly than before. Sleep is not a fall, it is a release, and the moon's descent carried that same serene resignation. Landforms responded too. Coastal plains, once shaped by layered tides, shifted their expectations. Without the smaller moon's faint tug, some beaches grew straighter, their curvatures relaxing like tired limbs. Others tightened into sharper crescents, guided now solely by the larger moon's insistent rhythm. River mouths widened or narrowed in answer to this new simplicity. The world's margins rebalanced themselves, each shift a quiet recalibration. In the deep parts of the sea, where the old rhythms had lingered longest, the moon's fading influence erased the last traces of the layered tides. Thermal ladders thinned, upwelling currents weakened or shifted. Dense layers of ancient water, once sculpted by twin pulls, began dispersing into broader gradients. The deep ocean's memory loosened. It did not vanish, but it blurred like ink soaked into damp pages, losing its edges. The skies also changed their habits. The long echo of the moon's old orbit, its faint tilt, its trembling path left the atmosphere uncertain for a time. Winds shifted subtly, adjusting to a sky with a single dominant moon. Storm systems, influenced invisibly by even the smallest gravitational nuances, reorganized their boundaries. Weather learned new tempos, a new language of movement. The moon, nearing a lower orbit still, entered a phase of eerie beauty. It appeared larger in the sky, subtly at first, then noticeably, not bright, not bold, but haunting in its expanded presence. It cast a faint, stretched glow across the seas, painting ocean surfaces with ghostly reflections that quivered even in calm waters. These reflections moved like memories, familiar shapes distorted by time. Earth accepted the sight with its usual patience. Larger moons heighten emotions for creatures that eventually evolve, but in these ancient days there were no observers, no witnesses to the moon's growing face. The spectacle unfolded for no eyes at all, offered to a world that understood only through geological breath, and still the moon drifted inward. Its orbital decay was gentle but implacable. Each cycle brought it closer to the point where the Earth's gravity would no longer allow it the luxury of independent glide. The companion did not resist. It simply followed the narrowing path gravity laid before it. Step by slow step, it approached the threshold between orbit and surrender. There is a moment in every descent, whether for moons or mountains or memory, when the slope becomes irreversible. The The companion moon was approaching that moment, not yet falling, not yet changing its fate, but entering the place where paths no longer diverge, the place where drifting becomes sinking, the place where wandering becomes resting. And the earth, holding to its quiet spinning, welcomed the moon into its deepening embrace, not with force, not with fear, but with the unspoken certainty shared by all ancient things, that every companion, in time, must lay down its light and fall asleep. As the small moon drifted deeper into its quiet descent, the world beneath it began to change in ways too slow for any single moment to reveal. These changes were cumulative, layered, as if time itself were laying thin sheets of translucent memory across the planet. Each sheet softened what came before, blurring edges, rounding corners, turning the sharpness of earlier ages into a smooth continuum. The moon's approach was not merely a motion through space, it was a thinning of distance, a contraction of silence, a soft folding of night around a companion growing drowsy. With each passing age, the moon rose slightly larger over the horizon. Its light did not brighten, if anything. It dimmed, but its closeness magnified its presence in the sky. Nights took on a new quality, a muted glow diffused through the thickening atmosphere. The world had once known a faint second lantern overhead. Now that lantern appeared swollen, heavy with a stillness that felt like a long exhale. Its glow seeped into the edges of clouds, making them appear translucent, as though moonlight were soaking through their invisible seams. And still, the tides adapted. Where once the moon's whisper tugged at the shallow seas, its nearness caused the pull to strengthen in unexpected places. Water rose, not with the layered breath of earlier epochs, but with a soft urgency, a curious insistence. Some coastlines experienced slightly stronger tides, barely noticeable compared to the great sweeps of the primary moon, but meaningful in the way a repeated touch alters the texture of sand. Lagoons flooded more often, mudflats reshaped their contours. Channels deepened in slow spirals, carved by the moon's waning but still persistent guidance. Yet for all this, the moon's influence was fading in spirit. It exerted force without intention, shaping the world the way a sleeping hand still curls around warmth. Its orbit tightened further, drawing it into a slow spiral that no longer crafted subtlety, but repeated a quiet, hypnotic cadence. Round and round, closer and closer, its path no longer wavered with the charming irregularities that once defined it. The moon had stopped improvising. It was following gravity's script, now simple, steady, and final. On its surface, the moon changed too. Impacts that once scattered dust into gentle halos now formed deeper scars, the rebounds dampened by its slower velocity. Dust no longer drifted outward with youthful confidence. It settled quickly, nesting into low craters like fine ash gathering on cooling embers. Each crater filled with shadow earlier in the day and held on to that shadow longer, making the moon appear older than its age. The once sharp contrasts between its bright plains and dark basins softened into subdued gradients. Its face blurred into a sleepy mosaic. The earth, unaware of its own role in this slow transformation, continued its patient rotation. Day warmed its surface, night cooled it. Winds traced their habitual patterns, land shifted, seas breathed, continents drifted with the persistent intention of plate tectonics. Through all this motion, the moon's descent was a silent counterpoint, an inward curve complementing the outward drift of the world. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when the moon aligned so precisely with the larger moon that the two bodies cast mirrored glows across the sea. Their reflections stretched side by side, thin ribbons of pale light trembling on the water's surface. These reflections moved like threads of memory, braiding themselves briefly before dissolving into the waking motions of the tide. Had there been eyes to see, such nights would have felt sacred moments when the sky revealed a quiet truth, that even in fading, companionship persists. But as the companion moon drifted closer, these alignments became less symmetrical. Distances changed, angles shifted. The two moons no longer performed their duet as they once had. Instead, the smaller moon's path fell slightly out of tune, like a tired singer struggling to harmonize with a partner whose voice remained strong. Its light arrived out of phase, its tide slightly delayed, its presence more often hidden behind the veil of atmospheric haze. What had once been a duet became a faint echo, a song dissolving into monotone. And beneath this dissolving harmony, the earth began storing the moon's fading influence as imprint rather than experience. Coastlines accumulated new layers of sediment shaped by the moon's inner drift. Lagoons captured unique patterns of erosion created only during this transitional age. Even the deep ocean felt the shift pressure waves traveling differently, the distribution of warmth altering as tidal input changed. These adjustments were not dramatic, but they were durable. The planet was quietly engraving the moon's final gifts into its geology. The sky, too, adapted. When the moon rose near the horizon, its light bent more sharply through the thick air. It appeared sometimes as a reddish haze, other times as a pale disk fringed with silver. At its highest point, it seemed almost weightless, an illusion born from its slowed motion. Its shadow on the earth grew softer, wider, less defined, as though the moon itself were dissolving into the night. There came a time when the moon's orbit decayed to such a degree that it hovered just above the threshold of gravitational stability, a place where a satellite no longer glides, but hovers in the slow tension between falling and floating. The moon lingered here for a long while, ages stretching out like the soft hum of a dream. It neither collapsed nor escaped. It simply rested. In this resting state, the moon gave the earth its final quiet teachings. Tides developed faint surges at irregular intervals, influenced by small orbital oscillations too gentle to cause disruption. The atmosphere shifted slightly under these minute gravitational cues, altering weather patterns in ways subtle but cumulative. Even the planet's rotation adjusted in infinitesimal fractions, imperceptible then, but destined to echo through millions of future days. The companion moon was no longer shaping the world with intention. Its influence had turned into the residual momentum of a presence nearing completion. Its narrative was softening. Its voice was fading. Its orbit grew so low that it skimmed the edges of gravitational repulsion without quite crossing the threshold. And gradually, almost tenderly, the moon began to surrender its identity as an actor and became instead a memory in motion, drifting toward a deeper kind of sleep. It circled the earth like a closing eyelid, bringing the world one revolution closer to the moment when even motion would become a kind of stillness. The moon's final circling felt like a long exhale across the planet's face. It no longer moved to be seen. It moved because motion was the last language left to it. Each orbit was a soft punctuation, a thinning of presence that nevertheless left durable punctuation marks in the world below. Marginal shelves deepened in places no single tide could have carved. Tiny basins held warmth a little longer than their neighbours. Layered sediments recorded the faint timing of a satellite learning to sleep. These were the moon's quiet gifts, small calibrations of shape that would outlive its light. Then, as gently as a closed hand, the companion descended into a state between motion and rest. It brushed the outer skirts of the planet's influence with a tenderness that resembled farewell. There was no fiery drama, no shattering collision, no great wash of noise. Instead, there was a soft folding. Orbital energy bled into the system in whisper amounts. The sky recalibrated, and the world accepted the absence as another kind of presence. The moon's face dimmed into a memory of silver. Its shadow thinned into a suggestion. Its pull softened into a geological grammar embedded in coastlines and stone. From that hush emerged a planet slightly altered, no longer twice counted in its nights, but carrying within itself the imprint of a companion who had taught it patience, nuance, and the modest mathematics of being held. The moon fell asleep, not with a break, but with a long, tender closing of attention. And the earth, folded by this loss into new habits, continued its slow turning, keeping the sleeping moon's lessons inside its deep, quiet architecture. The sky had always been a patient witness. Long before the earth cooled its first breaths, long before oceans learned how to hold their shimmering reflections, the sky kept its silent vigil, a vast, unbroken field of waiting. Waiting for light, waiting for shape, waiting for the slow gathering of stories that would one day drift beneath it. When the two moons travelled across its dark expanse, the sky accepted them not as intruders, but as companions turning slowly through its wide and ancient stillness. One bright, one soft, two paths of light crossing the void, with the measured calm of lanterns carried through a sleeping house. The larger moon traced its familiar arc, steady and certain, as though it had always known the route it was meant to follow. The smaller moon wandered just behind, a faint echo of the first, its glow thinner, its presence subtle, yet unmistakable in the quiet geometry of night. To the sky, these lights were not mere objects. They were motions, movements, whispers of gravity passing through the vastness like drifting thought. The sky does not speak, yet it listens, and what it listened to then was a duet of orbits weaving the night into layered lines of silver. Each evening, when the earth rolled into shadow and the first stars blinked awake, the sky felt the familiar imprint of the two moons rising. Their ascent was slow, measured, a ritual older than memory itself. The larger moon lifted the horizon into a gentle wash of pale brightness, while the smaller moon painted a softer glimmer beside it, as though the night were opening its hands to reveal two small offerings of light. Clouds, when they drifted, moved differently under a double moon. Their edges glowed in tandem hues, one stark and one muted, and the shadows they cast across the landscape below held two overlapping shades. Wind flowed through these shadows, with a subtle shift in its tone, as if adjusting to the layered instructions written across the sky. But time, even in the heavens, does not hold still. The smaller moon began its slow descent, its orbit tightening, its glow thinning into faint, trembling filaments. To the earth, the change was felt in tides and sediments. To the sky, the change was felt in silence. For the sky notices every habit, every rhythm, every repetition that persists long enough to become familiar. It had grown accustomed to twin arcs etched nightly across its expanse, accustomed to the double-limbed shadows, accustomed to the way starlight bent differently when it passed near two bodies instead of one. And so, when one arc began to dim, the sky held its breath. The smaller moon's path was still there, still drawn across the dark, but fainter, less assertive, a line dissolving into mist. The stars closest to its orbit began to reclaim their brightness, no longer softened by the moon's subtle veil of dust. Conjunctions that once felt like brief encounters now passed without note, their symmetry broken by the moon's quiet retreat into the deeper shadows of its own decline. The sky watched this with its ancient patience. It does not resist change, it simply receives it. But receiving change is not the same as understanding it. The heavens are vast, but even vastness can hold a kind of longing. Not the longing of creatures, but the longing of patterns that have grown accustomed to one another. The two moons had once created a shifting geometry, a celestial calligraphy that the sky embraced, as part of its nightly scripture. But now the smaller moon's handwriting grew faint, shaky, as though the ink of gravity were running dry. Some nights the moon barely rose at all, its glow smothered by distance and shadow. Only the larger moon carried the night, its brightness unchallenged, its dominance unquestioned. The sky felt the imbalance, not as loss, but as a change in texture, a thinning, a simplification of a once layers-deep story. Stars blinked through the empty space the small moon used to cross, their light no longer braided with its glow. Meteor dust passed through the orbit uncoloured, shedding brief streaks of fire that felt almost intrusive in their singularity. The sky had learned to expect two wanderers. Now it was asked to welcome only one, and the night felt wider for it. Not larger, but wider, as if the absence of a second path stretched the darkness into an unfamiliar shape. Even the atmosphere sensed the shift. Air moves to gravity's orchestration, and the loss of the companion moon's subtle pull smoothed the wind's patterns. Storms reorganized. Jet streams altered their attitudes. The architecture of cloud formations grew slightly more uniform. The sky held all of this, with the same deep quiet. It had held the twin arcs for countless ages. Its patience remained, but its silence deepened. as though it were listening for a voice that had already begun to fade beyond reach. The smaller moon continued to drift inward, closer to sleep, its light thinning like distant breath, and the sky, unable to intervene, simply waited. For that is the sky's nature, to wait, to witness, to carry the shapes of things that pass through it. Long after those shapes have disappeared, the arc began dissolving, the brightness faded, a trail that had once divided darkness, now blurred into nothingness, and the sky held this fading with its impossible calm, the calm of something vast enough to understand that all patterns, even the loveliest, have an end hidden inside their beginning. The nights grew thin and the sky learned a new kind of hush, a quiet folded by absence rather than presence. With the smaller moon sinking towards sleep, the heavens found themselves rearranged in ways that were not loud but architectural. Light redistributed, angles altered, the slow grammar of motion rewritten. Where once two arcs braided starlight into mild interference, now a single course held sway, and the cosmos adjusted its ledger accordingly. Constellations kept their places, but their conversations shifted. Light that had once been softened by a passing companion returned to the pure punctum of distant suns, crisp and indifferent. The firmament, vast and indifferent, kept its archive of changes not in words, but in the arresting of patterns, subtle, stubborn adjustments that would be read as difference by any future mind patient enough to notice. The smaller moon's retreat was a reteaching of scale. The sky learned that multiplicity could be temporary, and that the absence of a partner reconfigures even the loftiest geometries. Air is a teller of small truths because it bears the reactions that light and gravity set in motion. With one moon less to temper the night, the atmosphere changed its habits. Thin, noctilucent veils, once tinted by the faint second glow, lost their layered colour and settled into more uniform pallor. Upper-level winds, nudged for long ages by twin lunar pulls, altered their courses by fractions that meant storms would wander slightly different paths in ages to come. Weather's large gestures are the cumulative record of many small cues. The sky's simplification nudged storms into new drafts and taught clouds to gather with more homogeneity. Where interference had once lent complexity to the movement of air, now the flows smoothed, and the weather, like a music edited, acquired a simpler refrain. Light itself changed its manners. The thin moon had been a shy editor of luminescence, scattering photons in soft halos that made edges gentler. With its absence, shadow lines sharpened in marginal places. The plains at dusk lost a second whisper of silver. A cliff face that had once received two layered reflections now took only one. The way surfaces held dimness altered the entire mood of the dark. Silence, here, had texture. A clear, colder edge, rather than the warm blur of doubled glow. The night, in becoming clearer in some parts, also grew, more exposing in others, revealing angles and planes that had spent epochs in softer relief. Far beyond the immediate atmosphere, the sky's long memory preserved the echo of the vanished path. Microlensing events, flares of distant sources, and the tiny, almost imperceptible refractions that had been modulated by too close orbits now returned to simpler signatures. Astronomical rhythms that had once been slightly perturbed settled into more regular cadences. The heavens rearranged their punctuation. Celestial timings that had been influenced in mild ways found new steadiness. This calm was not a return to a more perfect state, but a different state, shaped by the removal of a repeated small perturbation. Systems that had learned to track twin inputs now tracked one, and the math of their interactions simplified accordingly. There was a tenderness in the sky's passivity. It did not grieve. Vastness does not grieve as skin does. Instead, it archived, folded, and taught itself to wait on the new instructions carved by single lunar nights. Over ages, the imprint of the lost moon would persist, not as an active voice, but as a set of scaffolds, coincidences of angle, the preferential direction where dust had once draped, the faint channel carved in the corpus of gas and light. These scaffolds would alter how future perturbations read the sky. They would bias the behavior of atmospheres and magnetospheres in minute ways that multiplied over deep time. The sky, patient as always, kept these biases like pressed flowers between volumes of its long unwritten book, because intelligence, in the cosmos, is often the ability to learn to let go. The heavens practiced this discipline in silence. The disappearance taught a form of cosmic prudence. Patterns that were once reinforced by two inputs adjusted their expectations and embraced the economy of single causality. The result was a different sort of intelligence, a landscape of cause and effect simplified and yet richer in its new constraints. The night's etiquette changed. Actors in the sky learned new pathways of influence. Where two lights had once made room for subtlety, one light now demanded clarity, and clarity produced its own kind of beauty. The sky's patient acquiescence to this loss was a form of wisdom. It kept the lesson of multiplicity in its margins, while surrendering to the practicality of singular instruction. Still, pockets of memory resisted perfect translation. In some belts of the upper air, thin ribbons of turbulence remembered the old timings and held on to faint periodicities that were out of phase with the new order. These atmospheric ghosts were the sky's marginalia, small, local anomalies that spoke of the vanished companion in the same way a scar speaks of a healed cut. They persisted because physical systems, once tuned, require input to recondition. Absent that input, inertia keeps them echoing their old rhythm for surprisingly long intervals. Thus, even as the dominant nighttime script simplified, an undercurrent of irregularities stayed in the fabric of air and light, like an accent surviving after dialects shift. At the edges of the planet where atmosphere gives way to space, the two-moon era had written its faint ledger onto the distribution of dust and micrometeoroids. The vanished moon had been a slight shepherd of debris, its gravity corralling tiny particles into specific microstreams. When it faded, those streams dispersed slowly, leaving behind pockets where particulates had once collected. The sky retained these pockets as textured memory places where future comets and meteors would meet slightly altered conditions upon entry, where fire would trace subtly different arcs through the dark. The heavens had rewritten the initial conditions for countless small encounters. The outcomes of those encounters would ripple downward into the planet's record, and so the sky waited patient, enormous, reorganized, not indifferent, but resigned to the new geometry of night. It continued to receive light from distant suns, to house the slow wheel of galaxies beyond comprehension, and within its vast archive the loss of one lunar path was but a line of notation. Yet notation is precedent. It directs future readings and actions. The sky's quiet record of the vanished moon shaped possibilities that would be realized in shifts of climate, in the gentle repatterning of meteor showers, and in the sedimented responses of winds and seas. What the sky learned to let go of, it did not forget. It translated into new forms of order that cradled future unfolding. The sky grew accustomed to a quieter script. Where once two arcs had written twin gestures across its darkness, only one remained to trace a solitary line of pale insistence. Yet the absence of the companion moon did not erase its presence. It only diluted it, spread it thin across distances, like a faint tint that lingers long after the pigment itself has been washed away. Night became clearer, but clarity did not mean simplicity. The sky held echoes, and echoes, in celestial space, do not fade as quickly as sound does in air. They persist as patterns, as inherited tendencies, as slight preferences that shape the movement of things, long after the original cause has dimmed beyond recognition. On certain nights, when the earth tilted in just the right way, a strange brightness shimmered at the horizon, not from any object, but from memory itself. A pale arch of lingering light, like a ghost of a moonrise, stretched momentarily across the atmosphere before dissolving into ordinary dusk. It was nothing more than a refraction of the large moon's glow, twisted through layers of air still shaped by centuries of dual illumination. But the illusion carried a softness that made the sky feel briefly inhabited by its long-lost companion. Such moments were not rare, nor were they predictable. They were the sky's quiet reflex, like a hand twitching in sleep, at the memory of a gesture it once knew well. And the stars, for all their indifference, seemed to adjust themselves around this new emptiness, not in motion, but in mood. The constellations appeared sharper, their edges no longer blurred by the dust halo the smaller moon once carried with it. Starlight fell through clearer air, casting a colder brilliance across the world below. But clarity can be a kind of loneliness. The sky bore that loneliness without complaint, but the shape of night was undeniably altered. Where, once, there had been a layered glow, a gentle competition of two lights, stretching across the firmament, now there was only the single sovereign arc of the surviving moon. Still, the absence shaped more than the night. It shaped time, because the smaller moon had once slowed the night in subtle ways, delaying the rise of twilight, softening the edges of dawn, painting the transitional hours with a kind of lingering hesitation. Without it, transitions sharpened. Dusk arrived more decisively. Dawn cut more cleanly through the dark. The sky learned to keep time with fewer adornments. If the heavens missed the smaller moon's companionship, it showed that longing only in the gentlest gestures, in the way thin cirrus clouds stretched themselves into faint, curved lines, mirroring an arc that no longer existed, or in how the ionosphere hummed with slightly altered frequencies during long nights of cold clarity. The sky is not a creature. It does not feel sorrow the way flesh does, yet even vastness responds to change, and the removal of a familiar path left a shape inside its architecture, a kind of hollow geometry that nothing else moved to fill. Occasionally, meteors wandered through the old orbital corridor, once shepherded by the companion moon. Their fiery descent drew lines of brief brilliance, across the night, streaking through the empty path, as though tracing the ghost of the moon's former journey. And each time, the sky received the stroke without flinching, calm, wide, endless, yet somehow acknowledging that a corridor once filled with soft motion now held only the movement of stones burning back into silence. Over many ages, the absence became part of the sky's new identity. Loss, when stretched across cosmic time, does not feel like subtraction. It feels like reorganization, like the slow settling of dust into new patterns after the wind has ceased its conversation. Stars continued their distant burning. Comets returned on their long loops. Galaxies wheeled in their unhurried rotations. The sky, for all its small adjustments, remained steady in its vastness. But in one respect, it was changed forever. It had learned the difference between a night with two paths of light and a night with only one. And in that difference was a kind of quiet intelligence, the intelligence of a cosmos that understands impermanence, that accepts drifting, that welcomes disappearance as another expression of order. The sky waited, not for a return, for returns rarely happen, but for the next pattern that time would offer. It waited in stillness, in clarity, in the wide patience that only the heavens possess. For even when a light fades, the sky does not close. It remains open, vast, receptive to new wanderers, new arcs, new stories. It simply continues, as it always has, as it always will, and in that endless continuation, the memory of the smaller moon settled gently into place, not vanished, not mourned, but held, as all forgotten things are held in the sky, as a soft imprint, on the shape of silence. The night grew comfortable in its new simplicity, though simplicity was never its original form. The sky had once balanced two wandering lights, two silver currents threading through its darkness, two gravitational whispers shaping the earth below. Now, only one voice remained, and the silence where the second had moved became a permanent contour of the heavens. Yet the sky did not collapse into emptiness. It expanded into its own stillness, like a fabric unclenching after centuries of holding a shape. Where the smaller moon once carved a faint path through starlight, there now stretched a quiet corridor, a long, unseen scar where nothing travelled anymore. Stars blinked freely there, no longer softened by a drifting halo of dust. Comets passed through unhindered, following long, ancient routes the moon had once briefly disturbed. If the sky had a memory, it expressed it in the way light behaved along this corridor. Photons scattered less. Colours deepened in ways that felt subtly unfamiliar. The cold sharpened. Even sounds, those faint tremors of air that would one day be interpreted by curious future minds, changed their timbre under the altered canopy. This emptiness was not void, it was inheritance. An imprint curled into the sky's interior, like the faint indentation left on a pillow, long after the sleeper has risen. On rare nights, when the larger moon dipped low, and its glow hesitated at the horizon, the sky offered a brief illusion, a faint echo of the second moon's arc, drawn not by an object, but by memory embedded in the atmosphere. A soft band of refracted light, arched and shimmering, like the ghost of a path that once existed. It was not a return, just a reminder that no disappearance is entirely complete. Still, even these illusions faded over time. As the centuries lengthened, the air thinned its allegiance to the old patterns. Wind currents unlearned the subtle timing they once followed. Clouds massed differently, no longer bending around a second source of nocturnal guidance. Storms found new routes across the planet, untethered from the faint gravitational nudges that had once shaped their wandering. The sky became a quieter composer. It orchestrated new arrangements with fewer instruments. Yet in the vastness of its silence, something like wisdom gathered. For the sky had learned that even the most stable patterns can fade. It had learned that light can abandon its own path without warning. It had learned that orbits once intertwined can unravel gently, without catastrophe, without spectacle. Loss, on the scale of the heavens, is not an ending. It is a redistribution, a shifting of what remains into a form that can continue. And so the sky continued. Night after night, it opened itself to the single moon that remained faithful in its arc. It stretched itself around the soft glow, letting the light roll over it like a tide of silver. Stars shimmered with clearer voices now, no longer muffled by the companion moon's drifting dust. Constellations carved sharper figures against the dark canvas. Nebulae whispered through the atmosphere, with renewed clarity, their distant colours settling into the night, like silent lanterns. Yet the sky never lost the shape of the forgotten moon's path. It held the arc as an absence with meaning, a contour through which nothing moved, and thus, where everything could be remembered, air had learned the rhythm of two moons, for longer than the planet itself had held continents. Though the second rhythm faded, the memory of its cadence lingered in tiny asymmetries, subtle turns in migratory winds, gradients in temperature that made dawn and dusk, slightly uneven in their unfoldings. Every morning, the sunrise touched the upper atmosphere with a small delay, a remnant pause, born from centuries of two shadows, sliding across the planet at once. The pause was immeasurable to any single witness, but measurable across epochs, a faint aberration preserved in the slow ledger of the sky. This was the sky's quiet ache, not sorrow, but the persistence of shape, an imprint held not out of longing, but out of the nature of things that once were, for the universe remembers differently from the worlds within it. It remembers in geometry, in temperature gradients, in altered paths of light, in the specific angles at which dust gathers and at which it refuses to gather again. The sky waited, not for the moon's return, for it knew too well that no orbit curls back on itself forever, but because waiting is what the sky does. It is the backdrop against which all motion is measured, and thus it must remain, open, still, willing to receive. One night, long after the companion moon had settled into its final rest beyond memory, the sky seemed to steady itself, as if taking a breath no one would ever hear. The stars above brightened imperceptibly, aligning with an order the heavens had quietly rebuilt. Wind patterns stilled, clouds paused. Even the larger moon's reflection lay smooth across the sea. It was a moment of calibration, a reminder that loss reorganizes the cosmos, and the cosmos, in its vast patience, welcomes the reorganization without resistance, because intelligence, on the scale of the universe, is not the gathering of knowledge, but the release of certainty. It is the willingness to let a pattern dissolve into another pattern that will one day dissolve too. The sky had waited too long for the second moon's fading arc to return. Now it no longer waited. It simply held the memory as a soft, eternal curve, etched into nothingness. And beneath that curve, the world continued, turning, breathing, growing in the shelter of a sky that had learned how to let go. Light does not vanish. It lingers. It settles. It buries itself in places that do not look like memory. In stones, in tides, in the quiet corridors of ancient water. Even when its source fades, light leaves behind a residue, a thin sediment of influence, pressed into the world like the faint imprint of a vanished hand. The earth carries these residues everywhere, though they do not shine. They are fossils of brightness, not visible, not warm, but present in the slow geometries of rock and in the hushed drift of deep ocean currents. To find them, one does not look upward, one looks inward. In the era of 2 moons, light arrived in layers. Each night held 2 separate illuminations, a firm, commanding glow from the larger moon, and a softer, more tentative shimmer from its companion. The earth did not reflect these lights merely on its surface. It absorbed them, folded them, pressed them into the crust, where temperature and pressure could turn radiance into structure. Sediment, for instance, kept a record of the duet in its microlaminations. Grains deposited under the larger moon's tide formed bold, confident layers. But grains deposited when the smaller moon's light brushed the water, those settled differently. They aligned in gentler patterns, thinner, almost whisper-like. Each layer became a sentence, a soft alternation, a geological poem written slowly by 2 shadows. In certain shallow seas, where tidal pools collected light, like bowls collecting rain, the dual glow penetrated the water column and shaped the behavior of early minerals. Crystals grew in patterns that future ages would misread as anomalies. Slight distortions in angle, odd variations in thickness. Never realizing these distortions were the fingerprints of 2 different lunar illuminations, meeting on the same grains of forming stone. Light also left remnants in the deep, not as brightness, for the deep ocean never knew brightness, but as temperature stories, thermal gradients shaped long ago by the layered tides that carried warmth differently, depending on which moon guided them. These gradients persisted for ages, drifting through the abyss, as slow, moving fossils of ancient light. Even now, the planet carries these faint memories, tiny anomalies in heat distribution, odd pockets of warmer water, subtle stratifications in cold that speak only to the patient observer. They are not echoes of sound, but echoes of illumination, impressions of how the surface once glowed, long after the glow itself faded. Rock, too, keeps light, not in a way visible to the eye, but in its internal lattice. Minerals reshape themselves under the tug of dual tides, and the faint pressure differences created when 2 moons tugged on the crust at once. These distortions hardened, cooling into invisible seams. A stone lifted today from some forgotten basin carries the fossil of that old tension. It does not reveal it willingly, but it possesses it all the same. The land carries these fossils, in ways more subtle still. Certain ridges bend slightly toward directions that no longer align with modern moonrise. Cliff faces show faint biases in their erosion patterns, small leanings born from a time when 2 lights cast 2 sets of shadows across their newborn faces. Rain followed those shadows. Wind remembered them. Erosion learned their angles and kept them long after one of them disappeared. Even forests, though they came long after the companion moon was gone, retained faint consequences of its existence. The tilt of the earth, shaped in part by dual lunar influence, set the boundaries for climate, and therefore for whole ecosystems. Every leaf that ever unfurled, every root that ever searched through soil, did so under the long echo of 2 moons. An echo held not in light, but in the quiet mathematics of seasons. Yet among all these fossils of illumination, perhaps the most delicate are found in water. Water never forgets a rhythm. Where the 2 moons once braided tides, the sea grew accustomed to layered motion. Even after the companion moon dimmed, the surface retained subtle preferences, small hesitations in its rise, unexpected slownesses in its fall. These quirks migrated into deeper currents, where they became part of the ocean's architecture. Some of those currents still exist. If one were to follow them into the cold, unlit chambers of the abyss, one would find layers that refuse to mix, clinging to differences born in ancient nights, when two lights shaped the water in tandem. These layers drift through darkness, like long, thin ghosts, fossils of light, carried not in brightness, but in thermal memory. The earth is covered in such ghosts, invisible, harmless, quiet. They do not haunt, they endure. They hold the shape of something the planet itself has nearly forgotten, the era when two moons ruled the night, each leaving a different imprint on the world below. Light, even faint light, reshapes the places where it falls, and though one of those moons slipped into sleep, its influence did not end. It settled into stone. It settled into tide. It settled into the deep places, where water does not move quickly enough to forget anything. These are the fossils of light, not shining, not warm, but inscribed within the world, in quiet lines of pressure and temperature and form. And the earth, ancient keeper of forgotten brightness, still carries them, as softly as a dream carried, through an age that never learned to wake. Light leaves its signatures in places that never knew illumination directly. This is the quiet paradox of ancient glow. It does not need to be seen to alter the world that receives it. The smaller moon, in its long companionship, shaped the earth not by brightness, but by presence, a faint pressure of radiance, a soft choreography of shadows, a lullaby of reflected sunlight that seeped into the rhythms of land and sea, until the rhythms themselves became archives. When the companion moon dimmed, when its silver touch faded into the long hush of forgetting, its traces did not disappear. They migrated inward. They drifted into the folds of rock and the deep reservoirs of water and the small, sheltered places where time moves with the patience of stone. In dense layers of sediment, scientists of a later world, unaware of what they were truly reading, would find faint oscillations in grain thickness that made no sense when compared to the modern tides. These oscillations were fossils of ancient light, the imprint of a second lunar rhythm that once danced across shallow seas. No creature had marked these rhythms, no eye had followed them, yet the world had internalized them. In the same way, a dream embeds itself into a sleeper's breathing. Some sediments hardened into shale, tight and dark, preserving time as thin, delicate sheets. In these sheets, differences only millimeters wide held the memory of dual tides, differences so slight that they seemed to belong to chance, when in truth they were the handwriting of a forgotten moon. Far below, in the deep cold where sunlight cannot reach, and where even heat must travel slowly, the ocean preserved another kind of fossil. Thermal layers drifted through the abyss, carrying temperature gradients, set long ago by tidal patterns that no longer existed. Some of these layers, dense and ancient, still moved along their inherited routes, unmixed and unchanged, as though the ocean itself refused to erase certain memories. Currents that once rose in gentle spirals, beneath the overlapping pull of the two moons, left behind subtle biases in direction. Even after the companion moon fell asleep, the currents kept turning, in the same old spirals, century after century, their motion an echo of a vanished force. To observe them is to watch the earth remembering, without knowing it remembers. Rock, too, keeps the imprint of light, in its quiet architecture. Granite, that cooled in the age of dual illumination, contains internal stresses, not explained by the tug of a single moon. These stresses so small they are nearly inaudible, even to instruments, hint at a time when two gravitational beats pressed the molten world into alternating shapes. When the stone froze, it froze with those beats inside it. Permanent, unbroken, a silent metronome that never ticks, yet never stops. Limestones laid down in shallow seas carry faint chemical imbalances that reflect nights lit by two moons. Nights when photosensitive reactions occurred at slightly different rates than under the single moon that remains today. The rock does not remember the moons, but it remembers the rates, It remembers the pace of ancient reactions, the way tree rings remember drought. Subtle, quiet, but legible. Even the Earth's tilt carries the ghost of the second moon, not in physics textbooks. Those will describe more direct causes, but in the fine variations, the soft wobbling motions that shape seasons on a scale too long for any short-lived creature to witness. The smaller moon once steadied that wobble, just enough to coax gentler cycles from the planet. When it faded, the wobble inherited a different amplitude, a different patience. These are not visible fossils. They are not bones or shells, or impressions in mud. They are fossils of influence, fossils of illumination, fossils of rhythm. They inhabit systems, not surfaces. And because the world is always moving, the fossils move too. They drift in currents of salt water. They circulate in atmospheric tides. They fold into the crust and re-emerge millions of years later as minerals with stories buried inside them. Some fossils of light became habits of the earth. Take the slow breathing of shallow coves. In places where two moons once pulled the water, in overlapping patterns, the tides still arrive, with faint irregularity, a tiny hesitation between rise and fall, a barely measurable lag that persists not because of an active pull, but because shape insists. The shape of the coast, the depth of the basin, the slant of the seafloor, all were carved by a duet. The world no longer performs. Shape remembers. What force forgets? The same is true of wind. In some latitudes, the air still carries microcurrents that follow the angles shaped when two bodies once tugged on the world's spinning air. These currents no longer serve a purpose. The moon that helped shape them has been asleep for ages, and yet they persist, like a reflex the atmosphere never unlearned. The earth is filled with such reflexes, quiet, patient, engraved into its motions. And though no creature alive will ever see the second moon return, though no sky will hold its glow again, its memory lies everywhere, not as a shining thing, but as a pattern in shadow, a shape in motion, a preference in the way the world behaves. Light leaves fossils, even when it was never bright enough, to cast strong shadows, fossils that change not how we see the land, but how the land became seeable at all. The companion moon's brightness is gone, but brightness was never the only way to leave a mark. Some legacies settle quietly, into stone and water and time, where they wait in stillness, not to be discovered, but simply to endure. Light leaves its deepest fossils not where it shines, but where it withdraws. Absence, too, has a way of settling into the world. A quiet residue, a soft rearranging of forms that reveals what once shaped them, long after the shaping force has gone. When the companion moon fell asleep, its light did not vanish so much as loosen, unravelling from the sky and drifting slowly into the places where memory gathers without intention. The first fossils of absence formed in the sky itself, not as marks or scars, but as permissions, new spaces where stars asserted their brightness, in regions once held by the faint, shimmering presence of a second lunar glow. Constellations seemed sharper, the night grew colder at the edges, but even in this clarity lay the echo of what had been lost, the delicate softening of starlight that the companion moon once caused by carrying a small halo of dust around its quiet orbit. That halo dispersed slowly, dust streaming outward, like a memory evaporating grain by grain. Some particles bled into the upper atmosphere, drifting down over centuries, to settle anonymously into ice cores, peat beds, the silent floors of deep lakes. Each grain was a physical remnant of the moon's long wandering, a microscopic fossil of light left behind by a body that no longer shone. But the Earth held deeper fossils still. As the second moon dimmed, as its orbital arc flattened into final rest, the tides that once braided in its presence simplified into a single rhythm. Yet the coastline did not forget how the duet once played. Some shores kept their layered curvature, a soft double indentation, where twin pools had once shaped the sand. Other shores, those formed during the moon's earliest waning, still bear faint terraces, cut by tides that rose, half a breath sooner or half a breath later, because two lights, not one, once traced the water's edge. Even now, beneath younger layers of sediment, those terraces remain, a hidden architecture, a fossil of motion, and in the deep sea, where pressure silences all but the most patient forces, the moon's memory lingers as temperature. Warm pockets, remnants of ancient surface rhythms, descend slowly until they become thin, wandering layers that slide across the abyss, like drifting sheets of forgotten time. Some of these layers are older than mountains, older than continents. They are the ocean's deepest fossils of light, not visible, not warm, but carrying the thermal handwriting of a world once shaped by two lunar breaths. Even the planet's crust holds the memory in its slow shifting. During the age of two moons, the overlapping pull created tiny stresses that bent plates by imperceptible degrees. As the companion moon faded, those stresses softened, but the distortions remained, frozen into the lithosphere, as invisible crescents of pressure that still influence earthquakes and uplift in subtle, lingering ways. The world does not forget what has shaped its bones, but the most delicate fossils are carried not by stone or sea, but by the invisible ordering of time. The second moon once softened sunsets by delaying the last fall of light. For ages afterward, the atmosphere kept this habit, holding dusk a moment longer than expected, making twilight linger with an unearned patience. This extra sliver of quiet is another fossil, one hidden not in matter, but in rhythm. It is said by future minds that sunsets feel nostalgic because of colour or distance or the tilt of the earth. But perhaps the nostalgia comes from something deeper, a softness inherited from nights that once held two lights instead of one, a softness the sky practiced for so long that it never fully unlearned it. The earth carries that softness still. Every shadow cast by the single moon is slightly broader than physics alone would predict, a remnant adjustment born from countless ages of balancing two overlapping glows. The shadow widens because memory widens, because even darkness remembers being shaped in more than one direction. This widening is a fossil too, not a mark, but a preference, not an imprint, but an inclination. The world is full of such inclinations, places where the forgotten moon still persuades matter to behave in ways that no longer have a cause. Wind shifts, water hesitates, stone bends, light scatters. Each small behaviour is a trace of an ancient partnership, an echo of a duet once played beneath the sky. These echoes do not fade, they integrate, because the earth does not treat memory as a thing to preserve. It treats it as a thing to become. And so, the companion moon's legacy is not a crater, not a ruin, not an object lost or broken. It is a vocabulary, a subtext, a soft, steady shaping that continues even in its absence. Fossils of light are not discovered. They are lived. They unfold quietly. In every tide, every breath of air, every slow drifting current through the dark caverns of the sea. The second moon sleeps, but its light, thin, patient, unassuming, remains folded into the planet, as tenderly as pressed petals, kept between pages of stone. Its memory is not bright, but it is enduring, and the earth, turning slowly beneath the stars, carries that memory, the way all ancient worlds carry lost companions, not with grief, but with shape, with rhythm, with coastline, with currents, with a quiet inheritance of light that once was. The earth remembers differently than the sky, where the sky records absence as wideness and light as geometry. The earth remembers through touch, through pressure, through warmth, through the slow folding and unfolding of its mineral skin. Its memory is not written in brightness or traced in arc, but carried in weight, like a soft hand pressed into clay that dries without ever erasing the imprint. Long after the companion moon fell into its deep and unbroken sleep, the earth still held its shape. Not the shape of the moon itself, but the shape of being held by two presences. instead of one. A world learns nothing more thoroughly than the rhythm of the forces that cradle it, and the earth had been cradled by a duet of tides, a duet of shadows, a duet of faint gravitational breaths, for longer than any later creature would comprehend. Even after that duet dissolved, the memory remained, not as nostalgia, but as architecture. Mountains carried it first. During the age of 2 moons, their uplift had been coaxed by a subtle alternation of tension and release. 2 gravitational voices tugged at the crust in overlapping cycles, creating faint, rhythmic stresses that guided the orientation of ridges and the angles of ancient faults. When the smaller moon grew tired, those stresses softened, but the mountains kept their inherited posture. The peaks did not lean toward the present moon. They leaned toward a past choreography, their slopes shaped by an influence long dissolved into silence. Rivers remembered too. Their meanders, their soft serpentine gesture across plains, had once responded to tidal hesitations that no longer existed, and yet the gesture persisted, not because the tides continued to shape them, but because the land had formed itself around a rhythm that left an imprint deeper than the riverbeds themselves. The Earth's memory is not conscious. It does not recall events as stories. It recalls them as forms. Shallow seas retained the subtle curvature of dual tides long after those tides flattened. Bays carved by 2 patterns of rise and fall continued to breathe, as though listening for a cue that would never again arrive. Some of these places, quiet and sheltered, became havens for early life, not because the second moon still touched them, but because its long influence had folded stability into their shape. Life began in the memory of a moon that no longer shone, and that memory followed it upward. The first filaments that attempted motion did so in waters, still structured by ancient gradients that the companion moon had helped sculpt. Those gradients guided early migrations, small upward stirrings, the tentative exploration of warmth and shadow. Thousands of millennia later, when creatures with skeletons and eyes and inward architecture moved through the tides, they inherited those patterns, not through knowledge, but through environment. The world's habits became the habits of its inhabitants. Even the air, though shaped more by the surviving moon, carried traces of the second. Long before forests rose, long before continents filled with breath, the atmosphere held faint oscillations in temperature and density, caused by the dual lunar pull. These oscillations influenced cloud formation, wind patterns, the delicate beginnings of climate. Once the companion moon faded, the atmosphere gradually shifted into new behaviors. But some inherited tendencies lingered quietly in its flows, echoes that no longer had reason but still had direction. Thus, the Earth's memory was not a vault of facts, but a library of habits. Patterns persisted long after their causes were gone. Shorelines curved with old fidelity. Currents hesitated in inherited rhythms. The tilt of the Earth, its slow wobble through the ages, was calibrated partly by the historical presence of 2 moons. The wobble shifted when one moon vanished, but the amplitude of its motion still carried the ghost of dual gravitational shaping. The planet did not cling to the past. It simply could not unshape itself. Every world is sculpted by what touches it, and every world continues, carrying the sculpting long after the touch is gone. Sometimes the memory showed itself in unexpected places. A cliff face eroded in a pattern that echoed the angle of dual shadows. From ages no creature could imagine, a desert dune held a curvature inherited from a long-extinct interplay between 2 nocturnal temperatures. A migrating species followed a route shaped indirectly by coastlines carved under ancient tides. Nothing remembered the companion moon as a moon. No creature ever looked up and felt the loss of a second glow. No forest leaned toward its absence. No mountain wept for its fading arc. And yet the Earth remembered, in every grain of sand, laid down in dual cycles, in every ridge, tilted by 2 ancient hands of gravity, in every current. that still drifted with an inherited sway from an instruction no longer issued. This is how planets remember, not by replaying what was, but by allowing what was to remain quietly embedded in what is. The companion moon fell asleep, its light extinguished, its orbit surrendered, but the Earth did not lose it. It absorbed it. It internalized it. It carried forward 1,000 subtle instructions that together formed a long and intricate memory. A memory made not of brightness, but of shape, not of radiance, but of rhythm, not of presence, but of the soft persistence of everything that once held it. And the planet, turning slowly through its deep, unending night, still holds that memory, not as longing, but as foundation. The world was built with 2 moons in mind, and even with one, it continues as the child of 2. Memory, in a planet, is not something stored, it is something lived. Every movement, every contour, every temperature and tide is shaped by an inheritance that stretches far beyond the reach of recollection. The companion moon may have faded, may have slipped quietly into the long stillness of cosmic sleep, but the Earth continued turning with the architecture it left behind. The planet carried that architecture into every age that followed. Long after the second moon's glow dissolved, into the sky's quiet forgetting, the world moved through patterns that had been moulded in its presence. Mountain ranges grew, continents drifted, oceans deepened, yet beneath these sweeping changes lay the subtle, older instructions, the gravitational grammar, set when 2 lights once crossed the night. Some of the planet's oldest basins, formed in the early epochs of cooling, had been nudged ever so slightly by the uneven pull of dual moons. When the smaller moon drifted closer, its influence increased in specific regions, pressing gently upon the crust and creating tiny variations in uplift. These were not mountains, not even hills, just slow bends in the lithosphere, barely imaginable on a human scale. But those bends shaped the rivers, and the rivers shaped the valleys, and the valleys shaped everything that would one day live within them. A slight depression became a cradle for an inland sea. A faint tilt became the corridor for a future migration. A barely measurable gradient determined which regions would gather water and which would dry into plains. This is how the planet remembers, by carrying forward the consequences of forces long vanished. Even after the companion moon fell into inactivity, its influence remained locked in the frames of landscapes. The world did not need the moon to continue pulling at it. It had already been shaped into the form that responded to that ancient duet. Later ages, rich with life and movement, never knew they were walking through inherited shapes. Forests rooted themselves on slopes angled by 2 lunar forces. Rainfall patterns followed the wind corridors, once influenced by dual tides. Even the earliest migrations, those slow, wandering journeys, made by creatures stirring toward complexity, traced paths carved from memory, not intention. The Earth is a vessel of such inheritances. Every climate pattern, every shifting coastline, every persistent current is a continuation of sculpting that began in the deep prehistory of light and gravity. Perhaps the most delicate memories are held in the seasons themselves. For the tilt of the Earth, its slight inclination toward and away from the sun, was never perfectly steady. It wobbled, subtly and slowly, guided in part by the gravitational tug of 2 orbiting companions. The larger moon steadied the wobble, true, but the smaller moon provided a faint secondary correction, a whisper of alignment, that influenced the long arc of seasonal change. When the companion moon faded, the wobble shifted, not abruptly, but like a breath moving into a new pattern. It settled into a quieter oscillation, a slower rhythm, but deep within the layers of ice and sediment and tree rings that would one day accumulate, the record of that shift remained. The moment the Earth learned to balance itself differently. Fossils of that transition exist not in bones, but in patterns, a change in the shape of monsoons, a subtle relocation of prevailing winds, a long-term drift in rainfall distribution. Each of these is a memory of a moon no creature ever saw. Even the nights carried their inheritance differently. The darkness grew simpler, but simplicity did not remove the echoes of older forms. Shadows, once drawn by overlapping light, kept a faint widening, a holdover from the era when two moons drew them from slightly different angles. Creatures that evolved much later never questioned why shadows behaved as they did. They adapted to their shape, to their timing, to their texture. All the while, they were living beneath a sky that held the residue of an ancient partnership. And when life grew more complex, when eyes emerged, capable of noticing the night, those eyes evolved in a world already shaped by the loss of a second light. Perhaps this is why night feels deeper than day, as though it contains the memory of something missing, something faintly luminous that once softened its edges. The Earth's memory is never nostalgic, never longing, never reaching backward. It is structural. It is baked into its bones, its waters, its atmospheres. The second moon became a silent architect of landscapes, climates, and possibilities that would unfold long after its departure. The Earth did not mourn it. The Earth incorporated it. It absorbed the touch of a companion that shaped its infancy, and it carried that shaping into every age that followed. And even now, after eons have passed, after life has transformed the surface, again and again, the world still bears the quiet significance of what it once knew. The companion moon is no longer visible in the sky, but the world beneath it still moves, as if touched by two hands, one bright, one gentle, long after one of those hands fell into silence. The Earth remembers, not in words, but in shape, not in images, but in balance, not in stories, but in the soft persistence of what continues. Even after the cause is gone, the Earth remembers most deeply in stillness, not in the frenzy of storms, not in the upheaval of continents, but in the quiet intervals between tides, between seasons, between the long turning of ages. It is in these soft spaces that the remnants of the companion moon settled most firmly, tucked into the slow breathing of a world that had learned to carry memory without ever speaking it. Even after eons passed, after oceans changed their shapes and mountains rose into new silhouettes, there were places on Earth that still moved with a faint echo of the second moon's vanished rhythm. High on certain plateaus, winds curve around stone in patterns older than any living thing. Their paths follow pressure lines that were once tuned to the presence of two lunar pools. The winds do not know this, for wind does not remember. But stone does. Stone holds the grooves, carved by ages of dual-cadenced air, and wind, flowing obediently along them, continues the gesture without knowing the origin. In deep ocean trenches, currents drift with a subtle hesitation, a slight pause, as though listening for a cue that no longer arrives. These hesitations are fossils of ancient tides, the last faint pulse of a duet that ended long before life grew eyes to witness the sea. Coastlines, too, carry the memory in their shape. Some bays curve inward in ways that seem too symmetrical for a single tide to have carved. Others stretch outward with strange grace, their shallows forming long, sweeping arcs that mirror the old interference patterns created when two moons once pulled against each other in gentle opposition. Each coastline is a quiet archive of ancient lunar geometry. Most who walk along these shores feel only the wind, the water, the slow pulse of the great surviving moon. Yet beneath their feet lie layers of sediment, whose alternating bands are the lullabies of a second moon, a moon whose light never shone bright enough to leave bold shadows, but whose rhythm left imprints deeper than any shadow could carve. Even the planet's rotation bears a faint memory of the companionship it once knew. The Earth spins with a slightly altered grace, a motion partly stabilized by a moon that no longer orbits it. In the long arithmetic of motion, every influence is preserved, in the solution. Nothing is lost, nothing is undone. The earth carries that ancient influence. In its days quiet lengthening, in its poles slow wandering, in the precise but soft way the world balances its warmth and cold across each passing year. When the second moon slipped into its long silent sleep, the surviving moon became the lone sculptor of night, but even its solitary pull cannot erase the memory of a duet that shaped the world in its earliest hours. There are nights, even now, millions of years after the second moon faded, when the sky feels slightly wider than it ought to be, as if making room for a companion that once crossed its darkness. This widening is not visible, but felt in the way stars shimmer with a faint trembling near the horizon, in the thin band of clarity that arcs across the sky where the second moon once travelled. It is the sky's remembered accommodation, the silent courtesy it once offered to a smaller light. The earth, for its part, does not question the persistence of these gestures. It does not mourn the moon that fell asleep. A planet cannot mourn, but it can carry, it can bear, it can preserve, and so it does. The world continues. As the child of two moons, regardless of how many remain, it moves with the inherited grace of dual influence, its coastlines shaped by layered tides, its climates balanced by ancient rhythms, its deep seas drifting with the memory of a light that no longer rises. The companion moon is gone in form, but present in effect, not as an object, but as a shaping, not as illumination, but as a quiet directive, folded into the foundation of everything that followed. The earth remembers it, in every hesitation of the tide, in every softened dusk, in every curve. The wind repeats, without understanding why. The world is full of such unconscious rituals, gestures inherited from forces that shaped it before life began. Memory persists, not because the planet wills it, but because matter cannot help but carry the fingerprints of what touched it, and so, beneath the surface noise of weather and life, beneath the shifting continents and churning seas, beneath the dance of seasons and shadows, a deeper truth remains. The earth was made by two moons, and it still moves, as though one of them were dreaming beside it. This is what the planet remembers. Not the brightness of the lost moon, not the glow it cast on the water, not the path it traced across the night, but the shaping, the pressure, the rhythm, the quiet folding of its influence into stone, into tide, into the bones of the world. The companion moon fell asleep, but its memory, thin as dust, soft as drifted light, deep as the ocean's oldest layers, remains woven into the earth's long story. And as the world turns, through the darkness, carried by the solitary glow of the moon that endured, it carries within itself the faint, persistent whisper of the moon that once kept it company, a whisper that never fades, a shaping that never ends, a memory the planet will hold for as long as it moves beneath the patient sky.